He just wanted this dream to finally end. So he forced himself to introduce his name, Konohara Jin. And then, boom, to make it even worse, a full-on snowstorm kicked off. He could still hear his sister drilling him with fairness, urging him to grab sweets he refused, then snapping, so his aunt's work pointless. The hero offered for her to pick the sweets for herself, and instantly her anger flared. She snapped that he didn't need to be so picky, and he just sighed, thinking, yeah, that's my sister for you. He grimaced at those sweets, saying they tasted awful, and then noticed his sister practically shoving them at him. She wasn't planning to eat a single one. The young man realized she always made everyone else do her work and hid behind justice as her excuse, and that's why he couldn't stand living with her anymore. In the car, he blurted out, "How much farther?" and his sister snapped, "Shut up and sit still." When they finally pulled up, he groaned. This trip had drained him. Right then, his sister shouted his name while he was double-checking everything they brought. She pointed out which bag held the sake and warned that it was the heaviest one there was, then shot him a look like, "So you can lift it for real, right?" He decided it'd be safer to carry it himself if he could muscle it in the car. He could crush the weight here, too. The moment he stepped into a university in another prefecture, he vowed he'd be done with this infection for good. The next second, a young man was dropped into the forest. Panicking, where was the car? Because just moments ago, he'd been standing in the parking lot. He couldn't tell if this was a dream, because where did everyone go while they were still supposed to be heading to camp? He tried to breathe through the panic, but when he checked his phone, nothing, no signal at all. So he decided, fine, and started down the mountain, believing the city would finally show itself from the view below. He finally stumbled into the sea, shocked out of his mind, confused as hell, like he missed the punchline. He'd been walking for ages, yet there wasn't a single city or soul in sight. That young man was thrilled he'd hauled a refrigerator with him because it meant he had food and drinks stacked up for 4 people. He figured he'd better get ready for the night. But he seriously doubted he'd pull it off before the sun slipped away, and the wild part. The beach was spotless, like nobody had even left a scrap behind. And he couldn't stop smiling. His knife was in his pocket for a reason. He figured it was all because of his sister that he ended up having to show up at that fireworks show. He remembered his friend begging him to go camping, then kicked himself for delaying the survival shell, because that trip could have been the perfect escape from his sister. He was wiped out, yet the flames still wouldn't catch, and then it hit him. He had to rush because darkness was closing in fast. Lying in his sleeping bag, he felt exhaustion hit like a wave, wishing, praying that the second he opened his eyes, this whole nightmare would finally be over. He picked the road that led to the city, but immediately grumbled about getting chewed up by bugs, then muttered that later he'd have to grab some branches to build a fire. He finally hit the shoreline again, and boom, he realized he was stuck on an island, staring at endless water and thinking, all right, where do I sail next? Even if he'd have to build his own boat first. And he couldn't stop asking why this nightmare had picked him. He'd only gone with his sister to a fireworks show he didn't even care to watch. He blurted to himself that he had to grab some branches fast, then froze, thinking, wait, why do I even need them? And it all clicked. He needed them to keep the fire burning. The young man spotted something breathtaking, and shock hit him like lightning. He couldn't believe the island held wonders like that. He spotted a stream and nearly cheered water was right there, close enough to save the day, thinking that someone must have seen the fire's smoke. He grabbed branches and started back fast. The hero knew he had to build a real shelter, one that could actually hold, but he kept worrying. Would it stand on its own, or should he brace the whole thing with stone and dirt? During the night, he heard a strange sound and figured it was nothing more than a nuisance, maybe even just a loose hair, until he realized he couldn't keep putting off fixing the walls, so he hurried to wash up. He swallowed that fish and immediately grimaced, total flavorless misery, and all he could think was, where's the salt? He felt the water running out and chose to take slow, careful sips from the spring, then swore that tomorrow he'd finally fortify the house. The young man looked at the leaf roof and thought, yeah, that's the move. Then he whipped up tiny windows out of plastic bags to brighten up the gloomy interior. He dug a drain to shoo the rain away and stumbled on a rock. Then he had a spark and realized it could become a heater once he heated it up first. The hero pictured the bath hole he'd dug and decided even if it was tiny, it would still do the job. Jin was done with fried crabs and fish. He needed to break the routine and think of something else, fast. He spotted the leaves turning yellow, and while he was thrilled to finally take a bath, a worried thought hit him had it gotten too cold. He grinned when he saw that little pot. Now he could cook stews too, and suddenly his meals weren't limited to just one choice anymore. The hero told himself his shelter was good enough, even if it wasn't perfect then. Before he could do a thing, snow started pouring down and slowly swallowed the whole mountain. He stumbled on some mushrooms and couldn't stop wondering if they'd kill him. Then he snapped out of it and sprinted for home. Cold crept into his bones, and he knew the snow was about to blanket the whole island. Then his fishing plans shattered, and he couldn't stop asking himself what he was supposed to do next. Despair swallowed him as he wondered, was this really how his life was going to end? Alone like this? Suddenly, a voice ripped through the air and told him this wasn't his world, then confessed it had accidentally summoned him right alongside the hero. A voice boomed from the glowing light and said he'd accidentally answered the hero's summons. Now he's trapped in a brand new world. Jin shrieked in pure panic because he couldn't make out a single word until that voice dropped the bombshell they'd yanked him here right before he died. He spiraled in despair, screaming at the universe, "Where the hell did I end up?" He fumed at how anyone could say that and still expect faith, like the speaker wasn't some kind of spirit. The glowing ball of light snapped back, saying it wasn't just some spirit, it used to be a deity, and the summoning sucked its power dry. The whole point was simple: briefly stitch the two worlds together, and any living being would work. The deity laid it out in chilling detail. His world had to be spared from extreme materialization, while this one had to be protected from extreme spiritualization, and right before 3 chosen people died in another world, they had to pull off the summoning. Jin realized that with 3 of them standing there, Haruka had earned the title of hero, and once the deity said it, Jin understood he was next, teetering on death's edge. Another voice snapped that it didn't matter anymore, and the glowing ball in front of him pleaded, "Wait, please." She told them, "We'll deal with him later right now. We're listening to what he wants." The orb deity saw Rin's failure and figured it fed the link with even more energy, so the summoning range suddenly blew wide open. An old woman grilled him on who he'd pick, but the other woman snapped that it wasn't the moment while the genie and the deity started blaming each other, yelling over who was really at fault. Since he couldn't go back home, the woman told him he'd be handed one choice pick, a patron deity instead. And most times, it's the summoning deity. She shot back, "I'm Vaughn, a specialist in strength, fire, destruction, and regeneration." Then teased, "With my patronage, you gain power, new skills, and a smooth landing wherever you go." Then they all stepped up and announced themselves: Ludere with the earth and silence, Kadar with plants and strict order, and Ish with water and healing. Pal, earth and harvest, Mishto, light, wind, love and desires, and Hilera, light, love and beauty, all step up and share their powers. The orb god told Rin he'd mastered ice and darkness, but his power was crumbling and extinction was knocking on the door, so Jin snapped, ordering the orb of light to shut up. Jin demanded to know if his power would come back, and the gods hit him with the cold truth: everything starts and ends, and they were strong enough to earn the title they carry. Jin, completely baffled, blurted out, "Wait, can you actually pick everyone?" The gods warned him, straight up his life wasn't long enough, and when they tried to join forces, their powers clashed hard. On top of that, they weren't even close enough to make peace. Misto broke it down for us. Each god shows their charisma in a totally different way for her. It's love for Pal, it's friendship, and for Hilera, it turns into a full-blown obsession. Kadar pushed him to figure out what he truly wanted to do in this world and promised they'd help him pick the perfect skills to match. Jin shot back that he just wanted to live easy, no ropes, no pointless strings holding him down. He said he needed real power to roam the world without limits. Then Kadar leaned in and asked if he'd want to link up with the hero. The glowing ball of light blurted out that he picked Haruka because she's kind and she busts her ass, and Kadar leaned in and grilled Jin. Was he trying to shield her since their power spiked every time someone used their gift? Jin's stomach dropped as he realized his sister had powers too, and terror seized him, so he spun to the ball of light and demanded, "What did you give her?" The ball shot back that it had already poured out all its magic and dominance, and Jin immediately figured he had no business sticking around her anymore. Kadar laid out every power Jin would unlock: freedom, bond break, and the deadly edge of hero killer. He thrust a sword into Jin's hands and swore he couldn't survive a day without it, then promised that this blade could slice through most materials like they were nothing. Wang shoved a pouch into his hands, one that would keep traveling with him wherever he went. She said the power could blast plant growth into overdrive, and Jin shot back his thanks only for Kadar to smugly insist they should be thanking him instead. Jin asked if he could bring the puppy along, and Van snapped back that Rin's eyes had gone dark and his powers were gone too, so all he could give was just himself. Wang told him it was their parting gift, a cozy, safe home, and she made him promise to be careful, because their abilities might clash and leave them incompatible. Jin figured he just wanted a place where he could finally live in comfort. He spotted a gorgeous landscape and a mansion-looking house, and he couldn't shake the shock because the air was warm, even though it was supposed to be winter. He swore his new face was a wild symbiosis of three young gods, and he felt like they'd somehow birthed him. He slipped into the house and uncovered a stash so endless it seemed it could never, ever run dry. The pantry overflowed rice, veggies, and all kinds of meats, and he swore it felt exactly like a dream. He stumbled on a barrel packed with fish and couldn't help wondering, was it some kind of portal that would spit him straight into Japan? After surviving on pathetic rations, he couldn't even stand the sight of all that food. So he ignored the feast, grabbed a bath first, then dove in to eat. He sank into the warm bath with pure relief, his mind racing to remember the last time he'd actually washed properly, then spiraling into what he'd cook for dinner and whether his skills could pull it off. The genie spotted a water wheel, and his eyes lit up. This thing could polish rice like magic. He couldn't stop grinning at finally knowing how to use it. He stared at that little sleeving puppy and realized it had turned into his guardian. Then he clung to hope that, powered by his own strength, it could bounce back and recover. A young man decided to whip up steak with cabbage, an odd combo. But the moment it hit the air, he caught a strange smell of fish and crab. He took a bite and practically melted, praising how the salt and pepper danced perfectly with the fresh rice, pure heaven in every mouthful. Lying in bed, he convinced himself he'd left the fire burning in the stove, but he was too damn lazy to get up, so he skipped checking the locks too, swearing nobody would dare break in. He couldn't shake the fear. Would he really be living here in this strange, unknown world? And that too-soft bed just wouldn't let him sleep. He told me a whole week had slipped by since he moved in, and all he'd done was stuff his face and crash in bed. The healing skill stitched him back up, but the exhaustion he'd banked still clung to him like a weight. He realized the island had chewed him up way more than he ever expected, and now he was finally ready to be done with the laundry for good. Jean stared at his tiny menu, admitted he'd only order what he'd already tested, and decided that was the perfect excuse to go on the hunt. Then he set out to make ramen with mackerel and seaweed. He realized he needed more flour, but there was nowhere to stash it, so he clutched the map in his mind, remembered the god's money, and headed straight for the market. The hero stared at the world map he'd just received, teeth bared with one burning question: where the heck was he supposed to go next? He triggered his teleport skill for the first time, and the second it worked, he couldn't help staring like, so this is what it looks like. The young man ended up in Canum, a border town hugging the demon forest, and the moment he saw the chaos, he knew he could cash in by smashing monsters, pocketing rewards, and leveling up fast. He flashed his free Knight's ID at the door and paid the entrance fee, then sprinted straight to the Adventurers Guild to register, so he wouldn't have to cough up fees ever again. He grabbed new clothes so he wouldn't look like the fresh newbie, and once the shopping bag was in his hands, he smiled and kept right on shopping. He stared at the god's gift of money, jaw-dropping at the size of the pile, and he figured his sister got the exact same haul. Jin craved the local food, but before he took a bite, he fired off appraisal to check the ingredients. Then it flagged deadly bacteria in the meat, and that shock hit him hard. He spotted a farm tool shop wrapped in a gorgeous grapevine, walked right up, and asked the saleswoman for a tool. She immediately said yes. The hero asked the owner for a grapevine sapling, and the man gladly handed it over, then warned him, telling this fresh adventurer to snag some leather armor and hunt down a proper weapons store. He pictured that metal armor roasting in the summer heat, nodded along with her advice, and then thanked the woman for everything. Every bit of help and every priceless detail she'd shared. In the armory, he snatched the very first sword he spotted, and the moment it landed in his grip, it felt like it was made for him. He tried to appraise the weapon, but it didn't do much. So he bit the bullet and bought a sword, a set of maintenance tools, a belt, and even 2 knives. He snapped up a solid set of leather armor, grabbed a belt pouch, and stuffed a monster carcass bag for later. Then just like that, the shopping finally crushed him, and he needed a break. He found an inn to stash his luggage, but he had 0 plans to sleep there. He'd go home and then come back tomorrow because he wanted to visit the guild. At the guild, he leaned over the counter and told the girl he wanted to sign up as an adventurer. She just nodded and said, "Okay." The girl leaned in and asked if he'd fork over the registration fee or take the free quest instead. He chose to pay, then slammed the request in right away while the system processed his adventure record. He dove into a book about the demon forest to learn what lived there, and what he found shocked him. Those monsters were just animals twisted and possessed by evil spirits, and they were battling back against sacred creatures. A man strode up to him and demanded, "Did you request an escort to learn the basics of being an adventurer?" He told him he needed advice because his confidence was shaking. Then the man Ding, a 2 silver-star adventurer, introduced himself and said he was training fresh recruits. Then it hit him. Dean wasn't just a guy, he was the instructor, so he showed up alone. Dean was already about to introduce himself when everything suddenly, right as he was about to speak, a girl burst in and yelled, "Dean!" And just like that, he clocked they were name twins. Then she snapped into a full-on lecture, blaming Dean, the instructor, for his stubborn, reckless ways. Dean ordered the girl to shut up and stop using it to talk to the aristocrats. And Jin's gut told him the guild had rules about nobles that were way more complicated than they should be. The girls started bickering over who would handle the aristocrats' requests. One snapped that Chris was coming back tomorrow, while the other shot back that they couldn't dump everything on a single person. Dean snapped that he'd never be the contact guy, that was the guild's job, but the girl shot back, "Hey, right now there are only 2 silver-ranked adventurers in this city." She batted her eyes and asked him to come help her, then caught Jin staring and wondered if he should step in, except Jin just figured he'd rather head home. Then another girl marched up and called her Ms. Kana, thanked her, and with a sharp, sarcastic edge asked who the real troublemaker was behind her spoiled behavior. The girl behind the counter shot Dean an apology for their mess, then told him he could ditch the training request, but only if he picked a whole new candidate instead. He finally clicked there was a blood tie. Even though brother and sister relationships are one thing, he couldn't stomach what was happening right in front of him anymore. He insisted he didn't need an escort anymore and yanked his request back. Then the girl shot back an apology and offered a refund, and Dean, the instructor, burst out in shock. He thought sisters always loved bullying their brothers, no matter the age, and he hated that kind of bond so much he refused to use his break bond skill. The spirit told him he could reach her through his thoughts. Like that's how people usually trade messages with spirits and guardians. He asked if she could read his mind, and she said she could only see the thoughts he chose to reveal. And then, without a second thought, he started planning to break his bonds with his sister. She told him, "Don't be scared, use your skills, and the more you use them, the stronger they'll get." Then she warned, "And if your breaks are spread across a wider target, the bond-crumbling power gets weaker." She told him, "Use the skill on just one person, and everyone watching will still spread the rumors so the hit won't land hard." Then she added, "You can use it anytime you want." He kept wondering if she would have shown up, if he had actually unleashed his ability, and then he decided there was no escort coming, so he'd crash the mission solo. The hero skimmed the manual and learned the horned rabbit monsters lurked right by the demon forest. He figured out the weak rabbits barely even had horns tiny as bean seeds, so they were dubbed hornless, and he smirked, thinking his gear was more than enough to take them on. Jin ran into a rabbit and decided right there to put his skills to the test, thinking his storage power was the perfect trap for Zanzan Khan. Since living creatures couldn't be kept inside, he spotted the hornless rabbit's tiny horn and those shadowy circles under its eyes, and then it hit him. This was the exact monster he'd read about. The kid slammed the rabbit in one brutal strike, stuffed it into a sack, and promised himself he'd drain the blood later. Then his mind snapped to the store, wondering what would have happened if he'd grabbed that sword instead. He hunted down raspberries, currants, and medicinal herbs, then shoved them into the D-storage. And he couldn't believe it. This forest was bursting with nature's treasures. Unlike that island. He spotted those same mushrooms from before on the island, checked them with appraisal, and confirmed they were safe to eat. Then he couldn't help thinking, "Man, these skills are saving me right now." Out of nowhere, a colossal horned bear lunged into view, and sheer terror ripped through him at just how massive it was. He couldn't shake the thought of how effortless that bear went down, and how that sword sliced through everything. Then, Mishido's spirit demanded the real question. Why didn't he just use magic? He blurted out an apology and begged Misto not to pop up so suddenly, then admitted he still didn't know much about magic yet, but promised he'd dive into it the moment he tracks down his next monster. Misto told him to fire up the search skill, and he suddenly realized he'd stacked so many abilities that he'd nearly forgotten this one entirely. She told him he could tap into magic from every kind: fire, earth, water, light, ice, darkness, plants, and even wind. He blurted out the command and slammed the spell right away, Wind Slash. Misto tipped his hat and said goodbye, promising that other spirits would back him up someday. While she leaned in and warned him to stay sharp because real magic talent is dangerously rare. The young man decided his loot had to be sold to the guild, grabbed everything, and set his sights on teleporting straight to the gate. He strode up to the merchant and demanded a real appraisal, then pushed to sell every last piece of his loot. The merchant stared in shock at Jin's condition, and Jin just shrugged. This is better than having my head cut off. He thought seeing those monsters tear into carcasses would wreck his old nerves. Then, with his skill, he stayed ice calm, draining every last drop of blood from the rabbits and the bear. The merchant leaned in and bragged that the pelts were still in top shape, then hinted the Adventurers Guild might pay even more. Jin just shot back that he'd been warned already, and everything was perfect. The merchant snapped that the appraisal would take 15 minutes, and Jin immediately asked where he could learn to brew potions, because his mind kept circling back to that troublemaking brother and sister in the guild. The merchant pushed him toward the Doctor's Guild and the alchemists, then leaned in and said potion recipes were being sold right over in neighboring Otile. He stared wide-eyed at everything the place had to offer, from mouth-watering dishes to brickmaking, and even the potion recipes looked like they'd be easy to whip up. He switched to restoration magic for the injuries, but he played it off like potions because he could feel it. The ones with divine power weren't just holy. They were built with insanely high physical stats. The merchant shoved a magic stone into his hands, the same kind he'd only ever seen in that dusty reference book. He stared at the stone in shock, swearing it couldn't be that tiny. He'd fully expected it to be the size of a ping-pong ball. The merchant leaned in and asked if he'd sell it, bragging that it was big enough to fuel serious fire magic, and Jin nodded, sure he'd already got some magic of his own. He decided to hit the streets for a walk and grab something to eat before night crept in. Jean spotted bread piled on the counter, loaded with sauerkraut, ham, and cheese. He bit into the sausage and swore it was cooked to perfection. No nasty bacteria in sight. Then he grabbed the vendor's attention and asked for one. The young man spotted the dried fruit and worried it might be way too fatty. But then he figured if all these adventurers are here, calories must be worth every bite. He couldn't decide should he simmer them in sugar for sweet treats or toss them in to season his meat dishes. The hero spotted brown sugar getting weighed out on those old battered scales, and it instantly hit him with retro vibes. He caught the scent of sake and immediately wondered, can I even drink this? But he had zero clue what the legal drinking age was here. He stared at the sandwich like it was pure treasure, took a bite, and practically blurted, this is absolutely superb. He clocked the rich pork rind and that juicy filling right away. But the bread never really hit for him, so he even thought about getting a pig. He hauled himself back home, told Ren he was finally here, then noticed he'd barely eaten. Turns out his stomach shrank on that island. He leaned in and told Rin, I hunted monsters today and scored some cash, then admitted he blew almost every coin on potion-making tools. The young man watched Rin and knew she wasn't truly hurt or ill. She was just drained to the bone, out of strength. He could tell the treatment wouldn't work, yet he kept forcing himself to do it, again and again. He checked the fabric in Kanuma and felt it was junk. So he walked away and didn't buy a thing. Then he turned to books about this world, because his language skills let him dive right in. The hero decided to hit the royal capital tomorrow, and when he finally saw how huge it was, his jaw basically dropped. He grilled the guard for guide maps or any special leads, and the guard slid him a plain map, then told him to track down the merchant guild. The guard told him the square was packed with kids who'd point out anything for a little fee, so he thanked the guard and slipped him a tip. The guard leaned in and told him, if you spot a guy with blue-gray hair named Leon, track him down and let me know. He figured that, if he messed up, he could just bolt straight to the neighboring kingdom's capital. So why was he shocked to see all these tiny buildings jammed together and linked up like one living maze? He clung to the guard's tip and spotted a guy who matched the description, then strode up and demanded, Are you Leon? Jin watched the boy lock in and say he was Leon. Then ask what he wanted, so Jin begged to show him the city. But Leon's intense, heavy stare sent a jolt of fear straight through him. Jin told the guard to ask for a tour, and Leon shot him a menacing glare, demanding to know if the guard really said that. Leon said the timing was perfect and he had some time to spare, so he nodded and agreed to play tour guide, and Jen couldn't deny it. He didn't look nearly as evil as she'd expected. Leon hyped up the view from the top of the citadel, saying regular folks couldn't even reach it. And Jin shot back, so what's a must-see? Jin figured that because he'd seen this, Leon had to be something rare. So he leaned in and begged him to point out a great clothing shop or a top-notch restaurant. Leon shrugged it off too early for lunch, then pointed out a popular clothing store he swore by while Jin stared at his terrifying face like, wait, why are you looking like that? Jin demanded to know why every house wall in this city was chained together, and Leon snapped back that it was all to split the walls apart so the taxes could be calculated. Jin leaned in and asked, so what taxes hit here? Leon fired back with the market tax, the transport tax, the municipal tax, and even a glass tax. Jin blinked at the glass tax, stunned since Kanuma barely had any glass windows at all. Then he pointed out the giant building in the square and asked what it was, and Leon figured he was talking about the spirit branch. Leon told him every single thing here was built to win over the spirits gardens packed with plants, and a gorgeous courtyard where crystal-clean water ran. Jin figured this meant they were worshipping spirits here, and Leon rushed out an apology, saying maybe he should have gone there first. Jin swung by on his way back, convinced Leon was a solid man because sure, his guiding skills were a mess, but the guy's heart was in the right place. The butler marched up to them and grilled Leon about what happened and why he was there. Leon shot back that this was now the Adelheid family's palace, even though, for him, it had been home since he was a kid. The butler leaned in and said it straight that young woman was getting chased right now. A woman in uniform strode in, and Jin instantly clocked her as someone new. She told him they'd readied a carriage because this place was too dangerous and that they had to get out right now. The butler insisted it was just a smart retreat, but Leon objected, then the woman cut him off. The butler blurted out his apology and said Ms. Lilith and the young lady had been hurt. Then he insisted they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The woman demanded, "Why didn't you use the potion?" And the butler shot back that the moment the young lady ran off from her family, she'd lost any chance to go back and grab her things. She realized they were drawing way too much attention, so she bolted out of there before things got worse. Jean asked how badly he was hurt and thrust his potion at him, then added, "This one'll help." And the assessment confirmed he was totally fine. The butler said they were off to TM's shop. Then Jin stepped forward and introduced himself, explaining that Leon had already agreed to play tour guide through the city. The woman stopped, thinking hard, and Jin jumped in offering to get them there by road. Then he grabbed her hand and yanked her straight into the carriage. Jin couldn't stop wondering if it actually worked, then admitted he'd planned to test the potion on himself. First, he just never imagined it would hit him like this. The butler bowed and thanked Mr. Jin for all the help, and Jin just thought, I don't care about the store anymore, just get me out of here as fast as you can. Leon jolted awake inside the carriage and demanded, "Where am I?" Even after Lilith kicked him out, he insisted he'd never done a thing wrong. Lilith said she knew he was innocent, but his younger brother acted like the whole thing didn't matter anymore, like the only win was that he was still alive. Jin couldn't stop staring. Why was the domestic dispute victim suddenly running city tours? And what was up with the butler calling Leon young lady? The butler barked, "Madam Autohide," and spun back to Tom, muttering that it had been ages, and then he ordered her to get Mr. Jin's clothes ready. Leon shot Jin an apology for yanking the tour away, then turned to Tomei and told him, "I'm handing it all to you." Lilith blurted out. She was sorry for not introducing herself right away, then dropped her name Lilith of the Anverland family on Jenna, and handed her ring over, insisting it would help him snag an appointment with her. Jean thanked her and asked why she called him Leon. Kid, she just smiled and said, "That's my name for her, Leon." She leaned in and dropped the bombshell. Leon wasn't a boy at all. She was a girl, and her real name was Leora Adelheid. Lilith flat out said she's got a flat chest, a stern face, and a strength that would make most boys jealous. So yeah, people still assume she's a boy and nickname her Leon. The butler shot Jin an apologetic bow for the interruption, then warned him that every outfit is custom-made on order. So yeah, the prices hit hard. Jin figured out it wasn't a store at all. It was a tailor's shop. Then the maids swarmed him right away, pushing rolls of fabric and stacks of buttons into his hands as they started measuring him at once. Jean told himself he hadn't missed a thing, shoved all his purchases into the e-storage, and said the only leftovers were books because he'd already snagged the sheets and bedspreads from a fabric store nearby. He dashed back home and cracked open the books he'd just bought. He figured out quick reading at night only worked by candlelight, so he hauled in rapeseed oil and built a lamp from it because he had zero alcohol to spare. He figured today was weird as hell, but somehow helpful, because even if she kept clashing with the tour's priorities, she still felt like a genuinely good person. He had no clue where they stood these days, but he was clinging to one hope she was okay. He figured it had already been months since Rich finally woke up. First he took shaky steps, and now he was fighting his way back to full strength. He said that over the past few months, he'd been bouncing between farmers and carpenters, so he could learn how to raise livestock, make cheese, and truly master their craft. He decided he'd get cozy before winter hit, so he mapped out a plan to build a whole laboratory, and while the window was still open, he hurried to stock up on materials too, then remembered the cork oak sapling he'd just bought, and went straight to planting it. He couldn't stop thinking about how insane this seedling's power was because he'd already unleashed it on the grapevines. He decided that sapling was perfect treasure material, and now he was headed to shopping in Canham since his e-storage had piled up a mountain of loot. Lately, that young guy swore he'd been followed by the Adventurer Guild's pink-haired sister until he realized she was in trouble over the work he'd been doing for the Merchant Guild. He figured renting a house would keep him off everyone's radar. Then the girl gasped, because he was still telling her he planned to stay at a hotel. The realtor leaned in and said, "In this world, older homes sell for more, so any fixes or upgrades are on the last owners to handle." He nodded in agreement, certain he'd finally found a home where he could teleport freely any time. And then he jumped in to help the carpenters, craving all the know-how they had. The cold hit the moment he stepped out, and there she was, the same girl again, complaining she still didn't have enough change. She asked if he was headed to the demon forest, warning that once the cold weather hit, it had turned deadly. He just thanked her and told her he already knew. She told him, "Don't push it, life matters way more than money." And he snapped back, "I'm not forcing myself to do anything." Her older brother marched up to them, spotted Jin, and immediately apologized. Behind the counter, the girl leaned in and asked him straight if he was about to head to the Adventurers Guild, then warned him that Kana keeps getting chewed out by his superiors non-stop. Her brother snapped that they were pinning the Merchant Guild's capture of a promising adventurer on her, and he swore it was because of him and his sister. Dean claimed he'd stop by the guild, but only on one condition: he'd messed up taking that quest, yet said the pink-haired girl had acted way worse. Jean demanded he keep his sister away. He didn't want her trailing him, trying to strike up a conversation. Dean blinked in shock and asked, "Isn't my sister adorable?" Jean then went, "Wait, is it finally time to ditch those rose-colored glasses?" Jean snapped back that she had a repulsive personality and he'd never be into her. Then Dean leaned in and demanded, "So what kind of girls are you into?" He shot back that if he had the choice, he'd pick someone who's nothing like his sister, minimal makeup and zero loud, showy femininity. Dean stepped up and promised to lead him straight to the rare herbs as a real apology. Jean nodded along, because that's exactly what he'd already planned to do. He stumbled on an herb called kinka and immediately shrugged it off as some pointless little thing people used only to spike the flavor of fancy alcohol. Dean wrinkled his nose and complained about that grassy, earthy stink, and Jean just shrugged like, "Rich folks have their own weird habits." Then pitched catching a couple rabbits for dinner. Jean clocked every sharp, efficient move Dean made while hunting, and Dean just grinned, telling him he'd taken down bears on his own. Just fine. No big deal. He was totally thrown off to spot Leon or Leora and blurted out why she was there in the first place. Leora snapped back that she'd been out hunting bears and came here hunting for water, while Jin figured he probably shouldn't call her by name in front of Dean. Dean shot a quick question. "Do you two know each other?" And Leora stepped in, calling herself Ash, while Jin finally let out the biggest sigh of relief, because she hadn't used her name. Leora shot out an apology, admitting she never realized how brutal her suffering had gotten, and that she never paid for the potion either. Then Dean immediately offered them something to eat. Dean insisted bear hunting was a goldmine, so the potion cost wouldn't be a problem, and then he warned that rent here is brutally expensive. Jean asked what kind of hotel it was, and Dean snapped back, 1 gold piece a day. Leora had pushed the place on him, and Jin just stared shocked he'd actually agreed to that price. Dean insisted Amila was just burned out, and blamed the hotel for everything, while Jean stared at the whole setup and said their relationship looked straight up creepy. Dean said Amila was pure kindness, always doing whatever she could for other people. Then Leora snapped, telling him not to stare at her like that. Leora swears a spirit's lurking near Amila, and Dean's got a mark on his head that screams it's already been there. She shoved the flower toward him and demanded he look because, in her eyes, it screamed fake the whole time. She said it was a controlling spirit, but its grip vanished out of nowhere, right as Dean's knees buckled and he passed out. Then she leaned in and asked if he could touch them. Leora leaned in and told me it was their special bloodline, and this was the first time she'd ever met someone whose powers matched her father. She warned him to stay sharp because this power is exactly the kind everyone's hunting for. Leora blinked in shock. Jin somehow missed her joke, and she realized he thought she'd finally figured out he could see spirits. She realized this was only his second time seeing her, and she'd walked right back onto the same path as Jin where he'd told her, "You saved me and this man is your friend, right?" She snapped that it was her fault, told them to sit tight and watch what unfolded, and swore he looked exactly like the guy who'd grabbed the wrong card. She asked if he could see the spirit clinging to her, and Jen shot back that he'd check right now. Jean asked, "Does it hurt?" And Leora snapped back that it was just this constant dull ache. Then Jin couldn't help wondering if she'd really say dull if she felt it herself. He took one look at the assessment and got the shock of a lifetime. The spirit's name was Lu, and before he could breathe, Leora's father snatched him up just to mold her into something more masculine. Leora told Jin that when she was just 7, her father bound that spirit to her so she'd grow into a worthy heir, and then Jin leaned in and asked, "So do you have a younger brother?" She leaned in and told me her father once got drunk, woke up beside a woman, and she later abandoned the baby, just left it at home. So Jin started asking if she was some kind of courier. Leora shot back in their country, the firstborn rules as the heir, no matter the gender. But their family was hereditary military, and her father had pinned a spirit to her in advance, so it wouldn't mess with her training. Jean asked if it was weird to force masculinity on them, like they didn't even know the real point, and the ORA basically confirmed that was exactly the issue. Jean snapped that prying into family business was rude, but she had to chase this spirit away right now, because he swore it was fed up with the whole thing too. Leora demanded to know if he could fix the collar, since her father couldn't anymore. Then she pushed him to free the spirit the moment they hit the city again. Leora had pushed him to do it even if it all went wrong, and Jin remembered exactly why she dragged herself here to hunt bears, just so she could thank him. Dean snapped awake and immediately apologized, admitting he'd spoiled her rotten Leora. Just smiled and said that after he got pulled under the possessing spirit's control, he couldn't help a thing. Jin knew the guild would blow up the second they found out, so he decided to talk it over with Kana and bring Amila straight to the spirit branch. He figured there was a place like that in Kanuma, and Leora straight up told him it was where spirits gathered and where you could finally cast them off. Leora told him to use bear carriers if he planned to hunt bears, and Jin couldn't help but wonder what the heck those things even were. She told him it was their job to haul the adventurer's loot, and then she shoved a note into his hands, with the exact place and time, letting him know she'd already lined everything up. Dean winked and swore he'd never spill a word about seeing and touching spirits, and Jean finally got it. Leora clocked it instantly. Jin fought with lightning speed and surgical precision, and she knew she had to thank him. Jean watched her moves and thought they were the perfect blueprint. Then he grinned. He knew his own talent could let him copy every technique she used. When the carriers spotted the wealthy, fear hit them hard. They begged to haul their loads on their backs, terrified their cart would snap down on the spot. Leora threw him an apology and dragged him into it with her. Then they hauled the wolf carcasses side by side, while Jin was seriously relieved they hadn't gone bear hunting. Leora demanded to know where the butler vanished to, then asked if they could meet in Canham, while calmly insisting she could stay unconscious longer than Dean. Leora told him the renovations paid off and that he'd picked well. Then she teased, "So, how about a hot bath?" while Jin caught the scent of wolf meat. Jin promised he'd run a bath, told everyone a bathhouse sat nearby, then admitted the place had serious hygiene problems after they checked. He told her the bath was ready, and that the toilet was just outside the door. Then Leora thanked him, and he promised he'd be upstairs. He snapped a teleport back home, swapped into fresh clothes, and set up the guest bed, then decided it was finally time to install a bathtub. When he came back, he grabbed Leora's attention and told her to start. He got this gut feeling the bird was trapped, so he made a vow if he could, he'd rip that collar off. He felt Leora with his hands and swore she was totally flat cold, empty, nothing at all. So he called her name only for her to already be fast asleep. The hero leaned in and told the bird, "Your job's done now, rest." Then snapped, "Stop tormenting that man right now." He figured he'd have to grab furniture for the third floor, though he had no clue when she'd wake up. He was sure she might be stuck here for a while. He noticed she still hadn't opened her eyes then. Right then, someone shouted his name. The young man's eyes widened as he spotted Misto, Ludore, and Pao standing right there. He demanded to know why they showed up, and Ludor quickly apologized for the sudden visit, then said they'd come bearing a favor for him. Ludore snapped that his sister was overusing magic and calling it reckless. Then Mashido guessed the real reason she couldn't see spirits yet. Mashido snapped that the spirits were fading fast like their power just ran dry, and that they were about to vanish for good. Then she pointed down at a Namine, the one who looked like she'd already surrendered. Mashido said once Namine got her powers back, his sister would finally see the spirits, and he couldn't shake the fear that by then she'd throw dominate on every last one of them. Ludere told him she knew he didn't want to get pulled into it. But the spirits were screaming so loud it was unbearable, and if anyone was going to bring the silence back, it had to be her. Pal said he couldn't lock down the heroes, but if this kept going, it would hit a lot of people hard. Misto then urged him to look out the window. Mishto snapped that Tia's overwhelming dominance was messing with everyone in the area, so the spirits flocked to the one who could slip free with freedom. Powell told him to just name them, and she promised that saying their names would crush the dominance. Ludera shrugged it off and said, "Don't stress, it's just numbers doing their thing, and if you hate the name, then rename it." Udari told him that if he bonded with a spirit, it would hand over its power, and if he managed to snag the right one, giving it a personal name would make it even stronger. Misto warned them they couldn't step into the house without his say-so, then snapped, "Go on, start outside." And Jin couldn't shake the feeling that his life would never be peaceful again unless he followed that rule. 2 hours later, he was still rattling off spirit names, red, green, yellow, then 59, and straight on with the rest. Misto demanded who Asht was, and Asht shot back that the escape had gone off without a hitch. He demanded to know if she'd followed him, and she just giggled. Then he spotted the ash, saw it was a spirit, and realized she'd been with Leora all along. He told me he'd ripped her out of the spirit's grip, but she still wouldn't wake up. He figured Misto clocked the truth right away, that she was a girl, and she even swore she'd never meant to go physical, then played it off with a slick, coquettish denial. With a sly grin, she said she wouldn't have to run to the bathroom in her sleep anymore. Then he burst out, "That's it." She thanked him, admitted she hadn't even thought about it, then promised she'd wake up the day after tomorrow while he asked the name of the baby perched on his shoulder. He said the appraisal crowned the bird as Lu, and she fired back that the old contract was already dead, meaning he could rename it, just like she insisted. The hero scratched his head over that fluffy little bird and blurted out, "Fluffy," and the bird nodded along, feeling proud of its blue feathers, while the hero admitted naming stuff wasn't exactly his strong suit. He said the name was a short nod to the Italian word for blue. Then the bird asked if he'd stay with Ash. He shot back that she'd feel awful without it, and he agreed without hesitation. The young man asked her if she wanted to go back and keep handing out names, and she said yes. Then they arrived, and he thanked Kadar and Ish for helping them out. He pushed to keep going, rattling off the colors and warning they might have to repeat it in a month. Then, when he finally thought it was finished, she stopped him cold and made him wait, telling him to form a ball of light. She grabbed his face and demanded he open his eyes because she'd fused light with darkness for him, and it happened when the light spirits gathered to pour strength into his body, just like the old woman warned him. Danger was waiting. He'd seen that glowing ball work like a charm before then. Misto's warning slammed into him: when you cast magic, what you picture matters. He thought about asking for a second, then stepped right up and pitched them an offer, just to see if they wanted anything. He couldn't stop staring. They looked totally off, and one of them in particular just screamed danger. The blonde guy asked if it was really okay to shovel down that much salt, and the protagonist's gut screamed that something bad would hit him, but he pushed the fear aside and trusted his own judgment. He asked if spirits could eat, and she shot back that only the tough ones can, though it doesn't taste like anything. The old man then leaned in and explained that other spirits chew their way through life in their own way, depending on what they are like. Spirits tied to ice or flame. He told him to hold up while he finished his meal. Then a guy called the Wolf Rin said, "You'll learn under me my home is darkness and ice." And right then he grilled him. "So what's your plan for him?" She fired off an apology and admitted they'd look suspicious, and then the old man snapped in before his powers slipped away. He'd been a god who tore the earth apart. The dog snapped that he'd do whatever he wanted, wrecking everything on a whim, and the guy shot back like, "Whoa, sounds like you're an alpha dog." She pressed again, "What's an alpha?" And he snapped it out. An alpha is the boss who rules with 0 questions, and if anyone disobeys, the alpha turns cruel fast. He said the alpha is the strongest man of all, and that no rules can touch her. Then she cut in. Rich is a spirit wolf, and the man immediately demanded to know what the difference even is between a regular wolf and one like that. The old man said some people march to their nature, while others fight it, and Rich, he remembered, could talk circles and think fast, so he warned, "Be careful." He said they'd never spoken, and that the dog was running on instinct, though his little form was just too cute. Then she said he meant a lot to her, and he immediately blushed, thanked her for the advice, and thought, what a troublemaking devil she is. They thanked him for everything he'd done and begged him to keep supporting the spirits, and he nodded back, saying he understood. He thought he was a lone wolf, until he watched the dog play and realized he wasn't putting on an act. He told me he'd rolled into the pottery town that very day just to place an order for a bath. Malcolm introduced himself and asked what the new product idea was. Then Jean grinned and said, "My name's Jean, and it's not an idea, it's just a bathtub." The craftsman swore. It was all a coincidence because, out of nowhere, aristocrats from a neighboring country had commissioned bathtubs. Jin blinked in shock and admitted he'd only just started crafting a prototype clawfoot bathtub. So yeah, he could already guess who the customer was. The master said this was something worth diving into and demanded Jin's help to develop it. And Jin nodded fast, betting his skills would keep him under the radar still. One wrong move could get him caught. The man jolted awake, demanded the time, and admitted he'd been trapped in a crazy long dream. Then the genie said, 3 days have already gone by. Jin said he was just about to tuck him in and even apologized for waking him up. Then, when he finally roused, he spotted the bird and admitted casually that he'd renamed it while he was asleep. The bird leaned in and demanded his name, then the genie smiled and said, "I'm Az." He swore it was the perfect name. He said the bird already accepted the name, so it clearly liked Jin. And Jin was stunned he'd shifted into a beauty with not a single frown. Plus, it looked like Az had totally latched onto him. He snapped that, sure, he looked handsome to everyone else, not beautiful, and warned her not to stare at his sister or that pink-haired girl, or they'd never let her out of their sight. He asked if he should watch out for Mr. Jin, and Jin shot back, "So you're always this trusting." The young man assured him, "I'm safe here," then warned him, "But you'd better be more careful." He said he'd bring soup, because the guy's got to be starving. And the awakened man immediately asked if that meant he could finally stay. He shot back, "Of course." And since it was night, Jin told him to get well fast because he still had to cover the expenses. Ash gasped in shock, and then the man leaned in, asking Mr. Ash if he was okay. The man announced they'd finally made it, greeted Jin like they were the only ones in town, and admitted he didn't know anyone else, then offered to buy them a drink as an apology. Ash hooked his companion Nuth right into the story, a former butler, and then explained he'd chosen to keep serving Ash, driven by their deep bond, while brushing off how many people ever got in the way. He said the moment he dragged the girl to wipe out the spirit, half the guild dropped to the floor, so he begged her to keep it quiet, and warned her she'd have to climb back up from the very bottom. Ash said nobody escapes the spirit's pranks, and that she won't be judged as harshly, but he warned that with their clashing values, their jokes can turn disastrous fast, and somehow this time, she was treated like a human. The man admitted Dash wasn't exactly being polite, and Ash snapped that without Dean around, everyone would have thought she got away clean. Then he told Dean his expenses would be paid and sent him straight to the secretary. The guy said he'd booked a great hotel and could drive Jean there, but Jean wasn't buying it. She figured he was getting sick from the drinks, and when he asked to rent a room, they told him they'd rather grab a house instead. He leaned in and asked Jin if he wanted to spend a day with a mid-level adventurer, then flat out admitted he'd spotted Jin's weak spots and said that was exactly why it'd help. The man snapped that the adventurer wasn't exactly strong, but he always got the job done, and Jin nodded and agreed that would help. Then the man swore he'd introduce them tomorrow. The man leaned in and said, "I've got something to add," then told those weirdos straight up to steer clear of trouble. He told Ash to quit glaring with that frown, and Ash snapped back that he couldn't even argue with the way he looked. He shot Rin a good morning smile, then glanced out the window, and there it was, snow pouring down like the sky had opened up. He dug in, convinced that sour plum jam and cheese were pure genius, then realized winter had finally rolled in. He couldn't stop thinking about that wild time he ran into winter in the mountains. Jean said it was delicious, and Dean was clearly setting him up like an adventurer for the day, so Jin knew he had to get ready fast. He faced Ash and gave him a greeting he didn't even mean. And Ash wasted no time. He said he wanted to clear the air about what happened yesterday and the payment for the potion. Jin sighed like this was coming up again, and Ash snapped back that he wasn't pushing for immediate compensation. So Jin shot back that they should circle back once their lives finally settled down. Dean snapped his fingers and waved him over, then introduced him to Letza and Jean. Letza smiled and said, "It's so great to finally meet you." He greeted me and then blurted out a quick apology up front, admitting he wasn't into all those stiff formalities. Dean snapped his head toward Letzi, and Jean nodded. He got it, and he swore this was the dependable adventurer Dean had been talking about. Dean asked if everything would be okay because he had that pretty face, and let's say warned him not to mess it up again, since he'd already screwed up once, while Jean sat there thinking she'd heard it all. He demanded to know if they were secretly doling out gorgeous men to him on purpose, like the gray-haired one just wasn't cutting it, and then he shrugged it off, insisting it wasn't his problem because it was their job. Dean leaned in and asked Mr. Letze whether they should handle the request just like always. Jean leaned in and asked if Dean had any hang-ups about how he looked. Dean just shrugged and said he didn't even know. He figured his plea for an experienced adventurer's escort was finally approved. Then he made sure they understood what mattered most, their primary goal. He told me that fur and meat are selling like crazy right now, so we should hunt rabbits. Yeah, bears are an option too, but only the big ones. And horned rabbits have tough meat, yet their fur is absolutely gorgeous. Jin figured the price of bears had finally tanked. Then, let's say, told him to keep watching, betting it was Ash and him running the job. He told Jean that the grass and tracks could reveal a monster's direction, and even what it was. And Jean figured he'd met a real pro, then they proved it, when the rabbit's hind feet stomped huge tracks into the ground. He spotted fresh tracks from the fox and figured the rabbit had horns. Then Jean demanded to know why. He jabbed a finger at the claw marks in the snow, swore it proved something demonic was hunting a rabbit, and Jin muttered, "If a fox chases it, then it's gotta be a demon," and the whole idea hit like pure genius. Jin kept replaying his choices. Had he used the search and sword right, or did he mess it all up? Let's see, shut that doubt down fast. Sure, a bow can take down normal animals, but it won't touch monsters. Let's just say those monsters were way more fun because they attacked, and Jin was like, yeah, that's awesome, since he even got offered a chance to learn how to hunt foxes. She thanked Letza for the top-notch product, then straight up asked for a raise while Jin sat there thinking, yeah, I've got the same strong communication skills too. Like, he deserved the boost. Let's say Jean's style was close to Dean's, so with those thin hands, Jean's move would fit him even better, and Dean immediately offered him a drink. He swore he'd prove him wrong, and from that day on he started training his muscles like crazy and locking into a protein-heavy diet. He greeted the technician and demanded, "Is the bath ready?" And the tech shot back that he was perfect on cue, saying he'd just finished moments ago. The hero swore he'd totally forgotten about transport, and the foreman jumped in asking whether he should order a cart, only for him to snap back that it was already handled, while the foreman hurried off to pack it all. He couldn't believe how freaking convenient his storage ability was. Pride surged through him as he realized he'd pulled it off. Jean shouted at Ash, and Ash snapped, "What's happening?" She grinned and said she was moving, and Jin practically exploded with joy. "So you found us a new home?" he asked, breathless. "Where is it?" He congratulated her and shot back, "So you really think this is a coincidence?" She grinned and said, "No, not found the house," and he immediately realized it had probably happened because of him. She figured one conversation with him could snap her mood back into place. He blurted out, shocked, asking when she'd ever felt better. Then she swung the door open and invited him inside because the cold outside was biting. He poured the tea, thanked her, and then watched her grin as she said that fig pie looked absolutely delicious. She swore the pie was baked straight from Noth's recipe, and in that same breath, she made it clear this butler wasn't some amateur. She asked what he was up to, and she even brought up the bathroom. He told her it was easier to show her, but she figured it definitely wasn't some bathhouse. She stared in awe, and he laughed, explaining that this is what a bathtub looks like. Then hot water gets poured in. She gushed that the bathtub was downright stunning, swearing she'd never laid eyes on anything like it before, and he nodded back, thanking her, then told her they should test it out as soon as the walls dried. She asked, "Can I call?" Then he apologized for disturbing her immediately. She didn't waste time asking if it was the right tub. She checked and nodded, then told him she was totally allowed to use it once it was ready. Jin remembered she was from a noble family, and that the butler could come at him with trouble too. He didn't say he should have refused, but the thought made this moment feel risky, and Jin finally let out a breath of relief. He noticed the toilet was separate and odorless, then demanded to know which workshop built it. Jin just smirked and said, "Me." Ash leaned in and confirmed Jin had pulled it all off himself, surprising Noth so hard he didn't know what to say. Then Ash demanded, "Did you register the tech with the guild?" And Jin admitted, "Not yet." He didn't force them to register that tech fast. Jin just figured it was about to turn into easy money for him. The young man cursed through the biting cold as he stood alone in the snowy forest, thinking, this place is freezing. He thought he'd come to the lake just to sew a futon for Ash as a housewarming gift. But then he realized he'd better stitch a down jacket for himself first. So he tore through the hunting, finished fast, and headed home. I ripped out the noise so the prey wouldn't bolt early. He yanked the prey with the rope and then froze because he felt movement all around him. The instant the blood hit the air, other predators swarmed in, drawn like magnets, and he snapped the teleport on the second danger hit, slipping away from that incoming swarm, then fessed up, shaking, that he'd gotten scared. The young man figured he had to get warmed up first, and then he realized he still needed more feathers. The man nodded at Mr. Jin and asked, "How's it going?" And they told him everything was running smooth, right down to the thanks for him, because the hero could still remember how cramped the place used to be before the renovations. A young man arrived with a housewarming gift, a futon, and the man couldn't believe how feather-light it was, until Jin told him it was woven from the feathers of a white-horned goose. The butler froze, stunned to learn it was top-tier quality. The girl said those wild geese weren't easy to bag, and the man panicked that the gift would cost a fortune for their trip. Then the hero shrugged and admitted he'd only spent on arrows and rope, completely oblivious that they were fancy luxury-level stuff. The butler urged the young lady and her companion to come dine at his home or stop by since their kitchen wasn't ready yet, and the genie even asked, "Will you come with us?" He smiled politely and refused, saying it wasn't his place to share a table with his hostess. She shrugged and said it didn't matter anymore, because Surgeon was busting his tail for them. Then she asked if you'd be okay with the butler sitting down too, so the hero nodded and invited everyone to the table. He shoved a fig pie in front of me and tried to copy it. Then he pointed out a roast white goose the butler swore was a delicacy. They all raised their glasses and wished everyone bon appetit. The man praised the soup, honey, and cheese, but the young man caught Ash eating with a panicked look on her face. Then it hit him she was actually loving it, because her spoon wouldn't stop, and suddenly he felt like he finally understood her. He clocked it right away. She looked thrilled. The girl grinned and admitted she genuinely loved the food. He reached for yet another pie, then the butler snapped his name, cutting him off mid-move. The young man watched the spirits claw into the food and clocked it right away. The two on top were his, but the one below didn't belong to anyone he knew. Then he started to wonder, did Ash miss the stranger? Or is she secretly covering up what he can do from the butler? He tried to squeeze a way out of it like he had a plan, saying the temperature change was to blame. Then he let out a heavy sigh and admitted he'd have to clean it all up and grab a rag. While he wrestled with what to do with the spirit, his mind snapped to the properties of materials, and he realized something terrifying. Spirits can't slip through glass or some metals. He locked the spirit inside a jar packed with brine as punishment, smugly thinking the enamel container was the perfect cage, and he hauled it in just in time, promising the spirit its treats later. Right then, the butler barked his name, instant alarm. The hero jerked around, wide-eyed, and blurted, "Is something wrong?" The butler swallowed hard, apologized, and confessed that the spirit who wrecked the pie was his doing, leaving everyone absolutely stunned by the truth. And he couldn't believe his ears when the man said the spirit of the snowy night was named Quinn. He realized Quinn usually stayed hidden, and Ash had never even heard of him. He told her his family, the Powdills, were just a branch of the Adelheid clan, and they could never outmuscle the main line, so she figured he could only see spirits. Jin stared at himself, gray hair, amber eyes, and instantly realized he really did look like one of her relatives. So he muttered, "Wait, does that mean I can use spirits too?" With them on the run, he couldn't stop thinking about how messy a mistress and assistant bond could be, and he decided to stay out of everyone else's drama, though his doubts still gnawed at him. The young man begged, "Warn me next time," then promised to bring him a fresh pie, even as he pointed at the jar and asked if that smell was brine, only for the hero to confirm it. Then it hit him. The butler knew he could touch spirits, and despite the fear in his chest, he told himself they were still playing the same game, shoulder to shoulder. Soon, he packed up and headed to a bustling port city that never, ever stopped humming. He figured seafood couldn't possibly hurt, and with the country sitting right by his sisters, it was the perfect spot to sniff out answers, and according to Mishto, they'll throw magic around as much as they want. They say when people drain a spirit's magic dry, it can't just vanish. It gets trapped in an animal instead, just to keep existing. But if it feels offended, it morphs into a monster, and if it doesn't, it becomes a sacred beast. The hero figured he'd come here to sniff out whether his sister was tugging at other nations, and whether anyone had been whispering rumors that his little sister was using magic. Jin couldn't stop thinking about how to get the full story. Then he caught wind of a conversation someone from Surma was messing up their fishing grounds again. Hearing that, the boy's eyes lit up with interest, until the woman snapped that her son had tried to protest, then came back absolutely mangled. And they were furious. These heroes and saints were wrecking lives worse than any monster, and some even dared to hope the Demon King would grab them under his wing. Suddenly, the thief ripped the bag away, but Jin slammed into his wrist as the victim screamed. Then he stared at it all and realized his sister still hadn't changed a bit. He decided to grab some seafood and bolt straight home. The young man digs into the oysters with a grin, relieved that the good grades keep his stomach safe, then praises the grilled ones too, so he'll save the leftovers and marinate the rest in oil. And he swung around to Rich, asking right then if the dog was down to play. The dog backed up fast, and Jin jolted with surprise, wondering if his pet hated the smell of seafood. Then he noticed the sky going dark and snapped the light on. The light blasted so hard he snapped his hands over his face. And that night he swore tomorrow, before he even steps into the guild, he'll practice magic, so he can finally rein in this terrible control. Deep in the demonic forest, he roared out that training was about to begin. He let the force rip and dread hit him fast, because it was way stronger than he expected. Now he knew he'd need even tighter control than ever. Staring at the fallen beasts, he let out a shaky breath, praying this meant he was getting stronger. Then fear flickered. Did he push too far? In the end, He shoved the loot into storage, flipped on the light, and the whole scene looked way better under that glow. Gene decided to hit the message board and hunt down this month's hottest searches. Then someone pushed him to go deep into the forest and investigate it for real. The man swore his exploration turned up not a single three-legged creature, but in that demonic forest, something twisted was definitely cooking in the dark, and he'd been warned that these expeditions barely ever happen. With nobody even asking for three-horned creatures, he couldn't afford to gamble his life. A stranger drove a fist into his face, snarling that the three-horned ones weren't just tough, they were the real warning sign of black monsters, the kind that would keep getting stronger until it was way too late. The hero snapped to it when Dean shouted, "Chris!" and the name hit him like a memory he couldn't place. Then a voice surged out again, calling for him. The young man spotted Ash and the butler and shot back, "You guys just got back." They nodded and Chris grinned. "It's a Bears win." The blonde man snapped that even though she looked cold and serious, she had to get why the investigation mattered. And she shot back that she was just a rookie, so she didn't get a say. Jin felt his eyebrows jump at the nickname. He suddenly remembered maybe this was the same guy Dean mentioned the day he first showed up at the guild. The same story where someone flat out refused to tutor a nobleman and swore Chris would gladly make a deal with him. Chris apologized for cutting in, then blurted out, "So who's this drop-dead gorgeous kid?" like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Ash immediately agreed that was the perfect description for Surgeon. Then the blonde guy stepped in and introduced himself as Chris Eads, a silver-ranked 3-star adventurer. As they shook hands, he demanded they never treat his hair or eye color as some rare standout thing. He spun toward him and told him point-blank that Diggle and Jin should team up to hunt the three-horned ones, leaving Jin stunned like, "Wait, what are you dragging me into?" Chris grabbed the guy and dragged him along for their three-horned hunt. Gene thought they were setting him up to get blamed, but Dean stepped in fast, telling him he hadn't even found them yet. The blonde admitted he hadn't spotted a single monster, but his gut was going berserk, warning him something nasty was lurking in the forest. When Dean heard talk of intuition, his face lit up on the spot and he nodded right away, then only asked if they could push it off until spring. The hero couldn't believe he'd trusted Chris's hunch so fast, and then the butler quietly called out to him. The man swore a spirit was latched onto it. "He told me this spirit feeds him predictions. And here's the kicker, most people can't even see spirits. But that gut-level intuition supercharges his work." The young man felt like everything finally made sense. Most people never see spirits, and no one would dare chase off the good luck they bring. I figured those powers mostly do small stuff, like you don't get sunburned or you've got a tiny boost in health. Yet this blonde dude hit the jackpot. Like he suddenly got a sixth sense kind of luck. He realized this wasn't scouting anymore. It was a full-on hunt for silver ranks, and Chris leaned in like a warning, reminding him he still owed the guild. Dean figured they had to call in an iron rank hunter, someone who'd actually beaten two-legged monsters while Blondie pushed back, insisting they needed a pro who could capture three-legged ones instead. Since they weren't staying long, and they should snag backup from other guilds and the gold ranks too. He took one look at the spooky forest air, and Ash leaned in and said it felt that way because everything was packed too tight. The young man spun toward Jin, swallowed his pride, apologized for the ask, and begged him to follow them deep into the forest when spring was just starting to bloom. He shot back a firm no on the spot, stunning his counterpart with how fast the answer came. Dean told him, "Just grab your stuff if monsters show up. Bolt." Then he leaned in and admitted he wanted the boy to take a look at the spirits in the forest. And the kid figured he wasn't the only one who was curious. He decided it was time to bring Ash along too, so they could inspect everything together because the hero didn't think anyone else would join them. And honestly, that stopped mattering. The man pushed for a quick resolution, but with winter shutting everything down, he had no choice. He said he'd wait until spring, then hit him up through the guild when the time was right, and I agreed. By the fire, he stared into the flames and realized he'd barely gleaned anything in that port city, because if his sister had really unleashed that powerful magic, it might have been the spark behind the anomaly in the demonic forest. He can't stand the idea of cleaning up after them, and the fact hits him hard. He, his sister, and those two have been stuck here for months, with his sister living way out from the forest, so he decides tomorrow he's heading back into the wild. Trapped deep inside the demonic forest, he snapped on his spirit vision to see what was hunting in the shadows. And that's when he realized most of them were marching straight for his home. But a few black spirits slipped in too, shrinking down bit by bit until they vanished into nothing. Jin stared in horror as spirits ripped pieces from other people, swallowing them to patch themselves up, and when he saw that healing them was getting him nowhere, he He knew the only escape was to pour in his power, then seal them with his name the same way he did for Rich. Then he started naming the black spirits and slapped ordinal numbers on them 1 through 4. When he finally finished, he slumped back and let out a tired sigh, calling it quits for today because this time it was his move. Still, he couldn't shake the truth. Those spirits hated being made to obey, so he shut it down and swore he'd push it again tomorrow. Soon, he leaned into the room and shot Dinosaur a question. Was he distracting him? The kids came sprinting in, squealing with pure joy, and he yanked his way back like, whoa, hold on, because he was totally not used to hugs this tight. He showed up with a pile of gifts, especially liqueur, and the whole family head went wild with joy. Then he topped it all off by handing over a cake too. The boys just wouldn't let go, clinging to him like magnets, and Jin realized this family never stopped hugging him. The woman thanked him and told him to cut the cake so everyone could dig in together, and the boy nodded especially since he remembered teaming up with Mrs. Shiva and her family while he learned to make cheese on the farm. And he demanded to know what they were doing there. And they told him they were cleaning beans, one of those cozy winter chores by the fireplace, along with fixing tools and handling all sorts of other little jobs. The genie jumped at the chance to help the kids huddled by the fire, and the family head promised, "You've got my word." Then the woman lit up the room and declared, "The cake is ready." Everyone dug into the treat, and then the girl boldly declared she'd marry Jen one day. Her mother lit up, saying he was the perfect choice and would make her happy. But her father shut it down fast, saying he hadn't given his consent. Dinosaur claimed Tina told her that once she grew up, she'd marry her own father so Shiva couldn't resist teasing her husband for being a sore loser. And the hero just stood there, awkwardly blurting that he never meant to get married in the first place, and definitely not to a child. Rage exploded in the father's chest when the guest turned down his daughter, especially since he'd just fought to let her go, and now the brothers rallied behind their sister, begging to be let into Jin's family too. As he watched, the young man told himself this warm, happy vibe felt almost perfect until he stared at everyone laughing and playing and realized his own family didn't even come close to normal. While he was caught up in his daily routine, he didn't even realize spring had snuck in, and it was suddenly time to leave. Chris broke the silence with a joke, saying the Prince of Darkness was already here. Ash just got slapped with a brand new nickname, Moonchild, and it totally mortified her. Then the guy rolled up and greeted the hero. The young man said it had been way too long since he'd seen Letza. Then, Letza shot back that Chris dragged him into this and told him to watch every corner. And he hated the thought of bringing some newbie along, while Dean insisted the hero was out there hunting bears all by himself. Ash shot the finger at her like she was the rookie. Everyone talked about. Then Ash snapped back, pointing straight at Jin and saying, "Nope, that started with him." The protagonist finally realized, he'd been gone from the guild for ages, and it hit the hunter like a punch to the gut. Dean immediately snapped into logic the guild wouldn't have risked sending them on a journey that terrifying if everything had been truly falling apart. Chris broke into laughter and admitted he finally understood where that premonition came from, the one that told him to bring the Prince of Darkness along. The young man couldn't stop wondering, was his intuition spot on again, or did the spirit whisper the answer straight to him? Then he had to stare, stunned, as she gently caressed the dimple in his chin. Even with the headache it caused, the guild member thanked Mister for his help, then calmly treated Ms. Kana like she was innocent. When they got back, she demanded he spill every detail about the whole thing, and then the guild hit them with the news, one potion for each of them, wishing them luck and a safe journey. Dean clocked the wild bag and grilled him about the leather, and Ash immediately snapped at him about what he'd strapped on top of his backpack. The young man bragged that he'd made the leather himself, even hooking a blanket to it. Then the girl snapped, "Will it slow you down when the monster shows up?" The boy swore that big weight couldn't be stripped off fast, but Jin flipped over a special clasp and showed him the belt could drop in seconds. Chris studied his gear like it was a prize and realized it was way more convenient than lugging around those bags. The man asked if we wanted lunch and bragged that the weather was perfect. Then he admitted he'd expected the walk to be way worse. The protagonist fired up the stove, tossed in dried chicken, onions, and shiitake mushrooms, then hit it with salt and pepper until he declared, "It's ready." Dean eyed the sandwich like it might burn him, but he couldn't bring himself to finish it. The young guy offered to take a bite, yet he worried there was too much and it might go bad, and Chris just said the sandwich was soft. The boy admitted he liked his bread tougher, but the meat was so good it didn't matter then. Let's say asked what it was coated with, and the boy said, "Breading," while the butler just blinked, completely lost. The young man said it was pork mixed with egg and flour, then dusted with breadcrumbs and fried to perfection, and the butler warned that a truly great oyster sauce is almost impossible to pull off. Ash said it was so tasty, then asked if it was chicken, and the guy nodded yes, it was fried in oil, but warned it might be more complicated than that. And Ash just got the full rundown. Salt, pepper, garlic, ginger, fish sauce, and even brandy in the mix. Jin clocked it. His boots were the dirtiest, like he'd been walking wrong, so he tried to copy Knott's stride since Knott's shoes were still spotless, and Chris warned them that from that moment on, wolves were about to start chasing their path. The blonde snapped a warning these wolves might be weaker than bears, but they hunted in packs, so don't lean on them too hard. Protect yourself or bolt for freedom. Because the boy acted like he had it all under control, juggling his work like a pro even if he was a real pain to deal with. Suddenly, wolves burst onto the scene, and he doesn't get it at all. Why would they pick him? In his eyes, he's the weakest in the squad, but he clenches his resolve and declares he can handle them. Chris snapped that his defense looked awful since he didn't even need it. Gene muttered that he wasn't used to staying on guard, and Dean said he looked like he wasn't battle-trained yet. His power was a total trap. And that left them all feeling like the newcomers were too much for him. The butler warned them horned wolves crave the scent of blood, and they'd better move before it's too late, so they packed up fast and set camp as far from the area as they possibly could. The main driver, bouncing in his pegs, snapped, "Is this enough?" And Dean shot back, "That dude's totally used to it, even though he probably hates hiking." Chris couldn't help admiring how he'd slapped together a waterproof tarp roof and a wall, and when the blonde dubbed him the Prince of Darkness again and lunged for a hug, he recoiled because not loving camping and not getting it were two totally different things. He remembered one thing: he'd actually survived all alone on that island for nearly 2 months, and now Ash saw he'd tucked moss under himself for comfort. So he figured, all right, I'll do the same. Chris sighed that moss never grew in their camp and pushed to go looking. But Dean grinned and said they'd just fish for dinner. Then the protagonist offered to whip up soup, and they shot back. That evening's felt better, and a hot, hearty stew was exactly what they needed. He figured today's meal would be soup packed with dried meat, tomatoes, chickpeas, and veggies. And then he grinned and told everyone he'd even whipped up dough, too. Dean suddenly clutched his head, panic hitting him as it dawned. He'd forgotten something. And I watched him twirl something in his hands, and my stomach dropped like, oh no, this is some weird ritual. While the dough took its sweet break, Gene hustled and lined up all the breakfast ingredients. Chris asked what it was, and he shot back that it was a bacon and asparagus pizza, something the blonde had never even heard of, and once they saw the finished pie, Dean finally got it turning. The dough was the whole ritual. Davoretsky said he loved that salty kick, and that it would team up perfectly with other ingredients. Then he added that ketchup would hit just as hard, too. The man blurted the question again, what even was ketchup? The hero stared at him, thinking, do tomatoes exist here at all? He hadn't spotted a single one growing anywhere. He swore the soup had sun-dried tomatoes, but nobody even blinked until Ash chimed in with a big compliment, calling it seriously tasty. Chris snapped, furious, saying Jin would have made a perfect wife, then groaned at the unfair twist that he was the Prince of Darkness instead, and told himself he had no reason to feel bad just because he was the opposite sex, and absolutely no reason to wear that heartbreak face. Dean leaned in and asked what he liked, then teased him by saying his sister definitely wasn't his type, and admitted he was into plus-sized figures. Ash cringed at Dean's pretty impressive chest, and while the hero told herself not to feel jealous, she quietly begged the butler not to take it the wrong way. Then she said he's not a snob, he just struggles to talk to people, and even asked if he didn't trust anyone. He shot back that it was only fair because everyone around him felt like a trap he couldn't trust. Then he added that people had actually confessed love to him like it was some cruel joke. Chris was left reeling, stunned that anyone would dare mess with him like that. The hunter figured it was just a fluke and that the girl was only scared, but Jin snapped that it had happened 3 times at 6, 10, and 14 to totally different people. The hunter went pale and demanded to know if he was cursed. Letsa snapped back that not every woman is like that. Then he admitted he knew, still trying to move past it, and blaming it all on his sister. He remembered how the first time, it was her friend's sister, and he'd already talked her into it the second and third times. She vanished again, but those 2 girls were still tied to her. He snapped that it was all his sister's doing. She treated him like her property, and kept teasing him for laughs. So after the second time, he just nodded along and pretended to buy it. And Chris kept pushing him to stay positive. Jin realized that even in spring, the nights still bit cold. Then a bird burst into the sky and chirped that it had come to relieve him. And when he finally looked up, Ash was right there. Shock hit him hard. She thrust the treat into his hands and thanked him for everything. The girl said the coat felt so light and comfy, and he admitted he'd stitched it as a hobby. Then reminded her about the refund. Still, he couldn't shake the fear. Why was she wearing that terrifying look again? And did she really not like Florentine cake? She told him he was a good man and wished him a happy life, and he awkwardly blurted out a thank you, like he didn't know where to put his hands. Ash then snapped that the confession was just a prank, and he still believed she was only trying to soften the blow. He said that since then, he'd crossed paths with so many people that his mistrust was finally loosening its grip. And she smiled back, saying she'd be thrilled if their meeting helped make that happen too. The hero nodded, told her she'd go, and admitted that Asha's blunt honesty was kind of awkwardly embarrassing. He figured she was nothing like his sister. No hidden angles, no tricks, and he decided to crash hard tonight so he'd be ready for tomorrow. Ledza dug in and tore into the meat like it was heaven, bragging that it tasted way better out here than back in the city. Dean nodded fast and said he'd want a cold beer to wash it all down. They've been gone for days now, surviving the whole trip by hunting and gathering, all the while pushing toward their destination, and so far not a single two-horned or three-horned monster has showed up. Devoretsky swore it was red ain and ripe yag berries zipped with black pepper, and it went perfectly with black woodcock, but the guy just couldn't wrap his head around the name. Chris stared in shock as the bread cooked up in the frying pan like magic. Then he realized he'd been thinking it was black woodcock liver pâté, and when there was no milk, he drowned the weird smell in salt water instead. He figured liver packed a ton of iron and vitamins A and B perfect for a hike when they're living off meat and fish, and he couldn't help thinking he was the only one here actually caring about a balanced diet. The blonde leaned in and asked the Prince of Darkness if he was finally going to call it a night by the river. He told them it wasn't a sleeping tent at all. It was a steam bath, and while they were out fishing, he'd scavenged branches, lashed them into a dome, and sealed the whole thing with a tarpaulin. And he claimed there was a fire inside the stones once they heated up. You had to splash them with water fast to keep them under control. He even said you can roast yourself in a sauna like that, then drop straight into the river. Chris let out a thrilled little sigh. He bragged that nobody could touch him when it came to comfort. Then Jen handed him the sauna and sent him straight to bliss. The guy asked the others if they wanted in, and they jumped at the chance and agreed to wash up together. Later, Jin figured everyone had headed to the bathhouse, so he decided to crash outside tonight, right where he could see the spirits crawling around the forest near the riverbank, and he ordered his people to keep them far from him. The hero imagined scooping them up and naming them until panic hit. Because the black spirits were multiplying fast and drawing eyes, Dean said the bath left him feeling totally recharged, and Chris chimed in that they'd be moving even faster today. Suddenly, the hunter slammed on the brakes and jerked the group to a stop, spotting a three-horned monitor lizard waiting ahead. Letset said they were insanely hard to kill, strike the head or the heart, or forget it. Even then, they'd keep twitching for a while, so he warned the hero don't go anywhere near them until the hunter gives the okay. Dean told Chris, that monster's back is tougher than bone, so we strike the moment it lifts its head and shows its throat. We come at it from both sides. Ash threw praise at the work and said the whole thing played out exactly how it was supposed to. The man admitted that even with the certainty that everything would turn out okay, worry still gnawed at him, and Jin realized that this move by itself wouldn't save him. Then Letza stamped that fear into reality. Three-horned monsters were truly lurking deep in the forest. He said 2 weeks had already gone by, and that hornless or single-horn monsters usually roam this place. And the hero couldn't believe how massive the forest really was. Dean declared the mission was done, so they pushed onward a bit more, dropped camp, and then started their way back. Chris begged the Prince of Darkness to help butcher the carcass, and he gladly agreed. The man praised the boy's skills, and the boy just assumed it all came from hunting practice, like his own butchering style had finally clicked. He slid aside and spotted a huge black spirit, instantly realizing there were more of them around here, fewer than at the forest training ground, but way bigger. He couldn't help but wonder if a giant like that grabbed an animal, would it turn into a full-on multi-horned monster? Then he blurted, "So how much meat's left?" And in his head he decided that the monitor lizard probably tasted like chicken, so frying it wouldn't be so bad. He said there'd be plenty of meat, and Jin snapped, "While they're busy, let's grab asparagus." The hunter shot back, "Don't wander off, monsters hate fire, but a hungry pack could still come for you." He stumbled on winter furuhita mushrooms and garlic mustard, thinking, "Perfect, I'll make pasta tomorrow." And then he pushed forward with the search. Suddenly, he spotted a two-horned fox way off in the distance, but somehow already locked onto them with sharp eyes, sharper ears, and a nose like a bloodhound, charging straight at the flames without a shred of fear. Then he realized the fox was treating their camp like a buffet of prey, and panic hit, so he rushed to Letza, blurted that a monster was near, and demanded they wipe out the smell fast. He shrouded the meat in cedar leaves to mask the stench, shoved an ointment into the boy's hands to kill the smell, then ordered him to rub it on and hide on the downwind side. He clocked that she was already on the scene and realized the fox was weaker than the monitor lizard, meaning it was beatable. "And you can win all by yourself," Ledze roared at him. The hunter snapped in shock. "What is that?" And the guy shot back, "It's a fox," even as he muttered, annoyed that the hunter could have figured it out for himself. The man said Jin had crushed her, and the Deans practically froze, shocked that he'd taken down that two-horned monster all by himself. Chris blurted that it was incredible for a bronze rank. But the butler shot back that the real win was simple, everything was perfectly fine. Dean snapped that the hero was a good man, yet something gnawed at him, because they'd assumed the trouble would stay stuck with the monitor lizards, and Dean pointed out that, unlike foxes, monitor lizards almost never roam far. The blonde snapped that a three-horned wolf or fox could reach the city in a flash, and since one three-horned monster had already shown up, that fox stood a great chance of sprouting three horns too, especially with a two-horned creature already in the mix. The hunter said they had to report this right away, and that they'd be gone by tomorrow morning. The hero boasted that he'd snagged a pile of birds, and even seemed to enjoy that chicken, and the man laughed that it was downright delicious. Then he quipped that he ate better here than in the city, while the butler chimed in that the pasta was absolutely amazing. They say nothing weird happened on the way back at all, and the reconnaissance mission finally hit its end. The girl thanked them for their hard work, then straight up told them they had to report the mission to the guild's leadership. He told Ash and Noda to grab his reward because he needed to bolt early, and the butler nodded along. Then the girl shot back. "Wait, so what just happened?" He said he wanted to draw a bath and asked if we could swing by his place today. She said yes, and then Dean leaned in, demanding to know if he was leaving yet. Then he shoved him on his way and swore he'd come back later. With what the guild decided, he thanked him and headed out. Jean trudged back home and let out a weary, gut-deep sigh. He begged the spirit to tip him off the moment a guest stepped foot in that house, because if he kept both hearth fires roaring, the spirits trapped in the fireplaces could talk to each other, and he'd know in a flash if anyone was coming while he was out. He teleported to the next house to check it out, hated the idea of washing up in that freezing cold room, and decided to go see the other place instead. The boy ran up to Rich, scratched him behind the ears, and told him he was filthy so they'd save the fun for after his bath. He scrubbed himself 3 times, praying the grime would finally vanish. Then the spirit snapped in and told him the guests had already arrived. The hero blinked out and reappeared in an instant, telling them, "I'll be there in a sec." And then again, he splashed the pot with hot water. Jean swallowed his pride and apologized for making them wait, and they laughed back like, "This is your reward for it." Then he blurted out that the bath was ready, and the butler immediately bowed and waved the lady ahead. He didn't even get asked where he snagged that bathtub. Then he just said, "Eddy City in the Kingdom of Pasteur." The butler did the math with that distance. It'd take 6 months to deliver, so until then, they'd have to make do with a simple wooden tub. He figured the ceramic dishes were a clue, like he was from here. Then the man started asking about the robes he'd lent. Could he sell them? The hero shot back that he'd been handing them out for free. The butler leaned in and said that after today's guild meeting, they'd already kicked off plans for a strike force, and he and the young lady had decided to sign on. Too, the young man could only wonder if this was just another trip into the forest. Because, hey, he wasn't about to turn down free robes. He thrust a bag of money into his hands, and Jin reluctantly caved in. Ash leaned in and told Note, "I'm done finished." The hero promised he'd whip up the next pot of hot water, so he told her to sip some tea while they waited, and Ash jumped in to help the butler urge the mistress to rest, and the boy figured he couldn't let the mistress draw his bath on his watch. He said he'd go, and the guy snapped, "Don't rush, take it slow." Jin figured he'd never see her hair down again, and sure enough, there it was, that same nervous look creeping back. So he quickly asked if everything was okay. She asked him straight out if he'd ever seen spirits in the forest, and he nodded like it was the truth. Then she admitted the last time she'd seen anything like that, the court magician had gone on a rampage. He straight up admitted he'd never seen anyone pull off magic like this before, then pressed, "So how does this even happen?" The girl said spirits hand over their magic for one of 2 reasons: they like the bond, or they're trapped to a spell-made contract. Then they willingly share about 1/5 of their power, and you can squeeze out more magic by pushing harder with the contract or by defeating the spirit yourself. Jean explained that spirits are built out of their power. Burn it all, and they vanish. And then he asked if those disintegrating spirits felt the same kind of end. Ash snapped back, "Yes, and said their dark magic wasn't just about rage, it spilled onto the mage, and everyone around them too. Turning a beast into a monster was only part of it, when the young man asked if they could become demons as well. Ash answered, "You can." He worried his sister could end up as a demon lord instead of a hero, so he snapped that they'd better not touch that kind of magic at all. She explained that spirits don't just trade power, they steal it back, and that's how they get stronger. They're irresistibly pulled toward their matching element, and they're utterly devoted, drawn to magic because it welds together what should have fallen apart. She basically said, "Don't squeeze them too hard, and they'll rush to help you." Then she leaned in and added that Az could have gone black too, but he stayed right there by her side, and seeing it all, she couldn't bring herself to compare him to those spirits. The young man finally clocked it. Ash wasn't just sad, she'd spotted the blackened spirits, and he rushed to tell her to hold on for a second, then immediately apologized for making her wait. He showered her with sweets, then leaned in and begged her just this one secret: don't tell the butler. She said she'd never seen anything like it. And the guy snapped, "That's exactly why I told you not to talk, keep your mind off this," warning her that staying depressed for too long is poison. And then she apologized for bothering him. Ash shot him a grin and thanked him for the treat. The young man jumped in with a cup of tea, ready to wash it all down, then leaned in and asked if everything was really okay. She said she'd had apple pies before, but this one hit totally different. So she pointed at the red berries and asked what they were, and he snapped back, "Strawberries." The protagonist figured she probably tasted something odd first, then decided to play detective, and he couldn't help wondering if that's just how aristocrats were. Jean asked if she liked it, admitted he wasn't exactly the comforting type, and said all he could do was spoil her with something tasty. She agreed, and right away he caught that look on her face. She was genuinely pleased. The girl admitted she liked it way more than she expected, and still couldn't believe it would drag her into that kind of mood so easily. He just shrugged and said there was nothing wrong with it. And when he looked over, he saw Az finally light up like a weight lifted, and he knew she was feeling better. The young man stumbled into Letza's path and blurted, "You going back into the forest again?" Letza smirked and said, "Yeah, I'm right on time." He even asked her to stitch him up a matching backpack, just fabric this time, and promised to pay, and the young man agreed, saying Dean and Chris wanted theirs too, but only leather. He insisted he didn't want to stand out, because if it looked too special, someone would snatch it. He told them that every silver-ranked canoe had to join the expedition, unless they had a legit reason to bail. Then said the iron-ranked were invited too, and if they took down a few monsters out there, they'd earn a star. The hunter said the iron rank was packed with tough players who hit a wall, because they barely had any stars. Then he framed it like a once-in-a-lifetime shot for them, and the guy immediately asked, "So why can't we just rack up stars by doing the normal guild quests?" He explained that stars are handed out mainly for real, useful work, so villains trying to snag a fresh star find the door basically locked. And then he admitted he was seriously worried about how the expedition team was put together. The protagonist leans in and says, Letz's rule is clear to grab stars. It all depends on your rank. He's copper rank. But after delivering so many medicines, he racked up the stars he needed to pass the promotion test. The man said copper-ranked players could join too, if someone recommended them, and Gene shot back that Ash and Knot were in thanks to Chris's pull. Then he tossed his hands up and said he wasn't interested, asking, "So when do you start?" The hunter said it all hinged on Amadeo, and it'd likely take a month. The boy leaned in and asked, "Who's Amadeo?" The hunter grinned and replied, "A gold-ranked adventurer," and somehow the guild convinced him. He told them Amadeo had teamed up with a mage who was about to hit gold rank, and the guild basically shrugged. There weren't many new monsters out there, maybe just one or two, so with an adventurer like that on the team, they figured it would be enough. Letza leaned in and told me he heard a rumor. Apparently he could see spirits too. Jin charged into the demonic forest, then set his sights on monitor lizards because he was hunting hides to whip up leather backpacks for everyone. He snagged the first black spirit, christened it Blackie 95, and swore he'd hunt more because he refused to let Ash ever see those things again. He realized he was hit with a whole new pile of stuff he had to get done again. Jin blurted out an apology for the delay, but the butler just smiled and thanked him for his time. And he convinced himself this was the plan, so he headed out with them and handed over the bags they demanded. Ash shot an apology over that brutal deadline, and the guy said he'd pay only for Ash to wave it off and say it could wait. Then grinned that the production helped make it easy and asked if it was too soon to go grab the tickets. He leaned in and asked if the quest got delayed, because Amadeo still hadn't shown up. The girl nodded, saying things were already packed with adventurers, so it was smarter to knock everything out early. and the guy figured the same thing Let's had said. Tons of people had poured into this place. Out of nowhere, two strangers slid up to them and demanded to borrow money, and the hero froze in panic, like the trouble was stalking him even from the very doorway. One of them struck, but the young man just shoved him aside like it was nothing. Then someone rushed to ask if he was okay, and he snapped back, "I'm fine." Dean snapped at them to stop picking fights and talk it out first. Then he hit them with the truth mess with a black bear and "you're an idiot." The butler urged them to grab a bite at a nearby restaurant, and Chris immediately backed it, pushing hard to celebrate their reunion. The protagonist leaned in and asked what they'd been doing since the investigation. Blondie said he'd met with the guild, Dean had already bolted, and Letzi claimed he'd been out gathering herbs. Chris said he didn't feel like judging, but since it wasn't his quest, he pressed the guy and asked where he'd been, only for him to say he'd been hunting for a new place. And then Chris asked if he was really moving. Dean told him, "Yeah, I used to live with my sister, but now I'm stuck in an inn and I have to leave her with Mom." Then he went on, "The guild shipped her from reception to housekeeping, and if she stays with me, she'll finally breathe easy again." Ash replied, "I've been out bear hunting." The boy demanded, "Did you really think you'd been called a black bear?" Dean snapped, "No, she didn't." Then the butler broke it down. He and Ash got branded as bear hunters, and now folks sometimes mix them up. The young man figured if it came down to it, he'd pick the wolf. Then Chris shot that idea down, saying the bear picture just didn't fit his otherworldly beauty at all. The man snapped that the Wolf King, Balmore, was already taken, and that copying that nickname made no sense. So the boy pressed, "Who's he?" And the blonde man answered, "A legendary adventurer. They say he's missing, but his name still burns bright." So when someone questioned what Dean meant by fangirl, the answer came back loud and clear. It was confirmed. The hunter told him she became an adventurer because of him, then demanded to know if he'd ever explained how they met. Jin froze in shock, assuming he'd only started his journey for that reason, and somehow he'd already climbed all the way to silver rank. The protagonist told them the bags were done Chris and Dean's first, then one for Let's Say, and when he peeked inside, he froze at the sight of leather everywhere, snapping that it was going to cost way more. The butler swore he'd come with payment for them, but now it wouldn't cover a thing. Then the guy just shrugged and said, "Forget it. I'll buy you a drink when we get back." The adventurers promised him a barrel, handled all the snacks, and made it crystal clear that the cow carcass had to be prepped right then. Chris decided to team up with Letza, and the butler pushed them to meet there. Jean nodded instantly, insisting they were now bound to make it back safe and sound. Then he said they'd be leaving, and the goodbye hit hard while the hunter stayed behind to sit and wait. The kid asked if he was going the same way, and he told him, "Yeah, I rented a place by the gates of the demonic forest because it's cheaper there." Then added that the landlord jacked up the rent after slapping in modern toilets and, yep, that's apparently the whole deal these days. Asher noticed a toilet with a built-in drain, and boom, suddenly it felt like the most convenient thing ever. Because now he couldn't believe he once lived through that smell. Jean snapped awake, tore into breakfast, then vanished with that teleport and plunged straight back into the deep forest. Then he plunged into another midnight hunt, nightly catching of black spirits. He decided he'd had enough for now and went hunting for the mage from the Amadeo squad, eager to see them in action, betting the cleanup crew would be somewhere close, even if they hadn't started yet. And then he teamed up with the local spirits to get the full play-by-play. The protagonist chose to push farther than the others. He noticed the map stopped at the forest's eastern edge, like it was warning him that this place might be out of reach or crawling with spirits. Nobody's met before, so he went straight for it. Right out of nowhere, a three-horned boar erupted from the brush and charged straight at him. And when he realized how perfect it was, he grinned, like it was already destined for a mouth-watering stew later then. Right when he was about to cook, he spotted the wild asparagus and decided to pass it to the butler. Jin stared at what looked like a leopard ahead until it clicked, and he realized it was a snow leopard. He froze, stunned that his own words were even trying to come out. Someone had said he'd been given a request. Out of nowhere, a deer showed up and demanded I sign a contract with McGear. The boy's jaw dropped. He figured it was just another animal, then panicked at the thought it might be a spirit too, and as he stared at the snow leopard's horned head with no black spots, he couldn't help but believe it was something sacred. He demanded who McGear was, and the deer snapped back that McGear was his friend. Then the protagonist froze because if they were trying to sign a contract with him, that could only mean he was on the verge of becoming a black spirit. The deer carried the snow leopard's message, "We'll carve out a sanctuary anywhere in the forest, one that drives off monsters, black spirits, and every demon that dares to show up." Jin figured that forest base could help him name spirits, so he demanded where it was. Then Bars shoved him to mount the deer. He swung onto the deer's back and barked, "Go!" He pleaded for him to slow down, stunned by just how fast that deer could sprint. That young man blurted out if there was a way to stop things the normal way. Then the deer told Magyar straight up that Mao was back. The horse demanded, "Why did you drag this guy here?" The young man swore this was Magyar, then realized Mao was a snow leopard, only to watch his own form go pitch black as part of his body evaporated right before his eyes. Then he leaned in and said he was about to sign the contract, calling him out by name as he did it. The boy swore the spirits gave their names to the next person they'd bind into a contract. Yet if he tossed them a fresh name right away and they didn't fight back, the pact got even stronger, and Magyar just snorted, making it clear he wasn't about to sign anything. The protagonist figured convincing him would be a nightmare, so he demanded to know, are you going to use a magic circle or trap him with a sealing cage, and warned that whatever you're planning won't work on him. The genie warned him, don't be stubborn, say your name. But the spirit snapped back, that's terrible. Magyar finally said his name out loud, and the boy snapped, asking if he'd make the contract now. He said he couldn't hear a thing, and the other nodded along. Then Jin felt the magic surge into him and finally exhaled in pure relief. Then he grilled them about the sanctuary. Was there a spot with a stunning view, where spirits could reach easily? And if they had a gorgeous place with a big tree, thick greenery, and bonus points of spring nearby, he wouldn't say no. Bars barked at him to get on the deer again, and Magyar huffed, bragging that he was lucky to be riding canola, while the poor young man silently wished he had gotten a gentler, comfier ride. The boy thanked them, grinning like they beat his wildest expectations, and the spirit promised that now they'd build a barrier right away. And he leaned in, demanding to know if that horse would be all right. The deer shrugged and said it was fine. He'd already signed the contract, so he could pass. Jin shot them a huge thank you for saving him. The crew swore these places weren't even on the map. Then it blew wide open every time he uncovered a new spot. And he admitted he still hadn't visited a few of the places where he'd made contracts with Magyar, yet somehow they showed up there too. Jin practically buzzed with excitement. Now he could hunt for Japanese like greenery and uncharted land, and crank out an even bigger map. He was convinced this meant he'd finally found his new base. He couldn't stop smiling, this was amazing, and now he had to figure out how to grow this place even more, because they reported that Jin's business had blown up again. They said it was the trading city of Naruadid, and this young guy swore he needed a landmark before he built his new house, so he wandered around like a critic and zeroed in on the glass windows. The young man stared at it and thought, wow, this looks like the bottoms of two glass bottles fused together, but the truth hit harder. It was the clearest glass he'd ever laid eyes on, unlike the rough, bubbled glass back in Kanuma. And there it was, an enchanting parchment shop, blazing with a gorgeous engraving on its document case, selling dresses and fine fabrics. Then his eyes caught a red glass goblet etched in gold, and he just couldn't resist. He barged into the pharmacy, dying to see how far medicine had come, and then bam, cocoa beans hit his eyes. The clerk leaned in and said, grind and mix them, and you can brew an elixir of life. He pictured it bitter as hell without sugar, but shrugged. Maybe real medicine doesn't need to taste good. Jin swore the aristocrats were tossing them in with sugar, milk, and vanilla. And with the rush building, he just knew the price would spike fast. So if it jumped, he'd better snatch them up right now. He scooped up a small amount, shrugged, and decided it wasn't worth the trip. Then he saw the appraisal. It was a brutal, long production grind. And if the market town was charging that much, there was no way it wouldn't cost even more somewhere else. The young man swore he'd already snagged vanilla, yellow and brown mustard, and turmeric, then figured they'd be waiting in the food storage until he only wanted to line them up side by side and compare. And that's when someone suddenly shouted his name. He just couldn't stop admiring the beauty. But the young man panicked, convinced he was a bad guy, until the older man, dazed by how rude he'd been, swallowed his pride and apologized, then asked where he got the bag. He shot back that it was a brand new item freshly registered by the Adventurers Guild in his ear. And damn, it was incredibly convenient. Too bad the trip there takes forever. I figured the distance wouldn't be a big deal, but tearing through those snow-capped mountains felt almost peaceful. So I just grabbed the paperwork I needed and get started here. He nodded, agreed, and even apologized for bothering me. The hero figured this same offer had hit him like a hammer 10 times, but no way they'd drag him all the way to his ear. So he bet if traders were coming here, maybe they'd finally start building toilets. He crashed at the inn that night, checked them out, and got absolutely let down. So he snapped out of it and decided it was time to push onward to his real goal. He asked her for help, and she jumped in until he said he was hunting books about spirits. She shot back that this wasn't some specialty shop and that he'd be better off at a real bookstore. Jin then tried to bargain for a good deal, and Ash shut it down hard, saying that stuff wasn't officially sold at all. She admitted, yeah, it's not exactly legal, but if anyone can track it down, it's probably in Narawadi. And that's why he keeps lurking in local antique shops and those sketchy back alley stores. The woman said, books like that are getting brutal to find nobles buy them just to flex, and merchants throw up their own libraries to show off. And then the guy leaned in and asked, so what store can I trust? The young man leaned in and asked the seller if they were running any book sales, then pressed him on whether he wanted the books with their contents or with everything left out. The seller leaned in and said, yeah, some books are total fakes, just blank covers and an empty box, while the real ones hold true manuscripts, but every so often, the spirits mess with the ink and make the writing unreadable. The protagonist clocked that this book cost way more, and the seller shrugged that only someone who really knew the process could turn it into something decent. Then he stared and swore he saw a spirit perched on the pages, like it might be a mode or even live rewriting happening in real time. The employee said it was coded in a weird set of symbols, only the person who wrote it could ever read it. He added that some people deliberately lock books, so only they can read them. Then the young man shrugged, saying languages let him decode vocabulary and made up letters. But he still struggles when the clues get scrambled into anagrams and wild permutations of symbols and words. The young man told him this book had a second volume packed with magic circles and diagrams, then leaned in and asked if there was another book with a cover just like it. The seller said yes, but the book was packed with mind-bending pictures and messy diagrams, and the price was sky high. Gene didn't even pause. He snatched it and said he'd take it. He figured that if spirits were truly flying around, it had to be worth chasing. So he grabbed history books, medicinal herb guides, and even a stash of alcoholic beverages. He figured he'd nailed his goals, then realized the money was gone. That meant it was time to go home. He figured the first book wasn't just some spell guide. It was all about striking deals with spirits, weighing the perks and the dangers, and how everything could swing based on compatibility and mana levels because the risk changed with the very contract the spirit was bound to when your name got called. Jin figured magicians and sorcerers steal power from the spirits nearby, but the spirits don't always show up, and even the element might not fit, because trying to summon a fire spirit in freezing air is exhausting for him. The hero assumed all those spirits were basically the same, so he never questioned it. Then he noticed the ones who came to help him right after he named them, and something felt off because they weren't like Misto and Kalaf at all. So he shoved that glowing mess out of his mind, swore it had nothing to do with him, and insisted it wasn't his fault. The young man figured the spirits would never listen to the guy who wrecked their home, yet somehow he still believed he might be heard. The butler insisted that a hot breakfast always hits the spot. And look at this, he said, grinning at how delicious it was. Then he leaned in and told them he was thrilled they enjoyed it, because Ash and the rest were heading out on an expedition today. And since they had some perishable food back home, he'd invited them over. He said breakfast here is basically flour and bread. Some folks can splurge on dried fruit and meat, but the veggie soups get served cold, so everyone's craving hot food, and the guy even asked if they cook it in the mornings. The man insisted they only brewed the tea, everything else they snagged from the street by morning. As soon as the sun popped up, people were sprinting toward work and the fire struggled to stay alive. He thanked her for the treat, and Ash snapped that they had to leave or they'd be late. He shoved the lunch into their hands and warned, "It's a lot, so share it with Dean and the others, and don't you dare spill a thing." They thanked him one more time, then bolted out the door, so he figured it was finally time to grab building materials. Gene told Rich that a safe zone had popped up in the forest, said, "Come with me," and then boom, he teleported both of them away. The young man watched the spirits vanish on the spot and demanded if he'd shock them enough. Richie told him he could play, but he'd better not cross the faintly glowing barrier line, so he quickly cleared an open spot for the construction site. He mulled it over for a second, then decided to build a tiny 2-story house. And he decided every floor would get just one room, the first for tea, the second for rest. Then he started picturing a garden and a spot for Rich to play, so Rich could stay with him all day while he worked on naming the spirits. The protagonist said it took days to track down plaster, stone, wood, and bricks for the fireplace. Turns out this wasn't as easy as he'd hoped, so he figured it was high time for a lunch break. He mulled over the garden chaos because Rich was bursting with curiosity, and maybe he should just scatter a little of everything, so he started dreaming big, decking the house walls with his best finds. and climbing roses, then even building a coffee siphon. The young man blinked in shock when he spotted a snow leopard and a deer standing there together, and he couldn't believe it. Even the horse showed up. The spirits shot Rich strange looks. The animals demanded to know why Mr. Rich was there, and that question totally stunned the hero. The spirits couldn't believe how Mr. Rich wound up right there. The deer repeated the leopard's claim that he'd vanished 5 years back, and people whispered it happened because he couldn't summon the heroes, so the boy leaned in and grilled Rich. "Did you ever call these guys?" And I swear that look could mean a dozen things. Maybe he can't remember, maybe he refuses to, or maybe it's just too painful for him to even think about. The young man figured that since they already knew the place, this had to be Rich's old home, and honestly, that wolf would feel way more comfortable in the wild than stuck in the city. The deer claimed Mr. Rich was tougher than any spirit and even freer than the wind, then swore his voice could blast into every corner of the world. The protagonist clocked this guy as a hardcore lover of riches until the spirit snapped, "He's guarding this forest from the so-called Apostles of the Wind." Jean demanded to know who the Wind Apostles were. Snow Leopard smirked and said they held a majestic pose. The spirit swore every last trace vanished about a year ago, and the boy couldn't stop wondering if that was the moment it guided him home, right to that barrier, shutting him off from the world. Then it hit him. Rich didn't just survive here. He saved this forest from the Apostles of the Wind, which is why the East holds the forest and the West Coast is all mountains. Then he said the Apostles of the Wind are the old heroes and everyone who follows them. He stared in disbelief as he watched the past heroes wreck this forest, and for a second he even assumed the heroes around here were always this brutal. The deer confessed they'd try to crush Comic's grip on the forest first, then they'd build ways to travel across the water ships, the hero realized, and that hit him hard, because the plan meant leaning on Narvadita's resources. He apologized to Rich, admitting he'd likely been guilty of the same thing, terrified that one day Rich would turn that resentment into hatred. The spirit warned that this was a real problem. West of here, trees still refused to sprout. Jin believed cities and forests should be safe for people to live, but that meant tearing the woods back first, and once they pushed deeper into the forest, spirits, monsters, and wild beasts were going to hunt them down no matter what. He thinks humans keep tearing down forests, stacking up more boats, and grabbing new land, ignoring the danger as if it doesn't exist, and the horse snaps that today's heroes aren't gentle at all. Their magic darkened his body, so his comrades won't have to drown in grief. The genie told them, "Thank you," and made it clear they were the ones who set all of it up, while the spirit snapped that something truly nasty was going down right there. Someone told me this even high-ranking spirits don't really need anything, but they still have to keep growing, keep consuming. Sure, each one is weaker on its own, but the hero will shield them, and get this, he warned that you shouldn't get too close to the hero because she's way stronger. The young man swore he never meant for it to go this far. He didn't regret asking for the vault. But now, he'd have to figure out how to get stronger. Because the god's gifts are boosting him yet, it still doesn't solve the real problem. He has to learn how to fight. The boy snapped, asking if he'd lost both his strength and his memory, then turned to the horse for answers about Rich because he'd figured the map wasn't random at all. It was showing the gods' zone of influence and anything tied to them, and right now Rich's pull over these forests was barely there. Majir admitted he didn't have the full story, while the deer gushed that Lord Rich was amazing, and the snow leopard chimed in that he was braver and smarter than any spirit out there. He toasted himself, bon appetit, and then cracked a grin because the food was absolutely delicious. And he figured that once a house was built inside the forest reserve, he'd finally start farming, dreaming that potatoes and tomatoes would spread across the world, because right now they're only growing in and around this one place. Jin stared at the book's words and thought, if I befriend the earth and water spirits, I can secure a solid harvest, and maybe someday I'll finally eat at a restaurant that serves those ingredients. So he threw himself back into it. More houses to build, fields to cultivate, maybe even a few spirits to name, and honestly the non-stop grind was something he could handle, because now it was time to get down to business. The young man felt the planting and building had gone way better than expected, so he tucked a few pantry vegetables into the ground, praying the local spirits would snatch them up. Then he swore he wouldn't use the growth powder this time. He figured adding potatoes, tomatoes, zucchini, basil, arugula, and lettuce would make everything way more exciting. And then he checked in on how the expedition was going. No heavy worry, because the guild and even other countries had already sent their own teams. The protagonist gushed about Rich and figured he'd ask Dinosaur to throw a frisbee, since that thing was basically his gift. Then he leaned down to his pet and said it was time to head home because he couldn't wait to try something. The young man whipped out an idea and decided to build magic circles because that book he'd read made them jump out at him, and now he couldn't wait to try making them with his own hands. Then he poured in the magical power and ground the ingredients at the same time, splashed in the water where the spirits had danced, and sealed it all with ink, ready at last. Now he turned to the compass, knowing it was time to put it to use. He figured the whole job was simple. Pull the right shapes from that book, stitch them to symbols from others, and then panic about one thing. What spirit was he brave enough to summon? Suddenly, spirits started popping into existence, and he begged them to hold back so they wouldn't wreck the paper. Then he panicked, stared at his options, and finally went for ice. Jin couldn't shake the truth. Rich was a creature of ice and darkness, plain as day. He told his pet to help him chill the food, bragging that if he didn't have to trek up to the mountains for ice, he could whip up ice cream instead. Then added that he'd already planted a field, and he was praying that harvest would finally come in hot. The young man traced a fertility symbol, then poured his magic into it like it was alive. Suddenly, a spirit burst into view and introduced himself as Pow. The spirit claimed it guarded the land and commanded the harvest, so the boy swore he remembered, and still couldn't believe what it was. In a full-blown panic, I figured this was some divine prank, or he'd actually summoned her for real until Pal snapped that the ink was bad. The protagonist swore he built it exactly like the book told him, but the black-haired kid snapped back that it was the wrong book. Then the older man grimly admitted the only thing it could summon were local spirits with names. The girl said he was bursting with cheer, and she couldn't stop laughing at how fun it was to watch him. He couldn't believe they all showed up out of nowhere. Then the girl leaned in and told him, "You brought a whole crowd of good spirits with you." And she told her that's exactly why this place feels safe. And then the boy finally understood those tiny flashes of light weren't random at all. They were spirits, here for only a breath, waking in the morning and vanishing before nightfall. Jin figured everyone finally showed up: Ludere, Kadar, Mishto, Halalfa, Ish, Van, and Pal included. And when Ish asked if he could quiz them about spirits instead of stuck in books, the boy blinked in shock and said he didn't mind learning. Wong huffed, "Fine," and pitched a little sparring, saying anything beat being stuck inside four walls, and snapped that he was moving the wrong way. Up until now, the protagonist believed he'd just been copying everyone else, training hard, learning everything he could to get stronger until the spirit cut him down with one truth: he had zero control over his movements. He figured he could just copy their moves and call it a day without stopping to adjust them to his own body, so he couldn't honestly claim his judgment was wrong. He pressed him, asking what kind of sword he imagined in his head, and the boy just froze, said he had no clue. Maybe something straight out of fantasy or old historical dramas. In his world, swords weren't used anymore. And his sister was all about fantasy, while he and his grandmother kept binging historical dramas. And he realized those movies had left a mark. But this sword, it looked exactly like something straight out of the games, so he ditched the idea and went with a different blade. The guy was stunned. Zenzenkin looked completely transformed. He blurted out that it was a katana. He clocked that it leaned more into fantasy, wearing a shiny silver chain instead of a cord. And Wang said it was an insanely rare kind. The young man leaned in and told him, back home, those swords were the real deal. The spirit leaned in and asked if he wanted to keep going. He lit up and said yes without hesitation. They looked at the blade and thought, yep, this is just like a normal fantasy sword. And suddenly, every game effect imaginable started flashing in his head. But now that he could actually picture the moves, it got way more fun. The man broke into praise, saying it was way better than before, and the boy's face lit up with pure relief. Jin figured, of course, he couldn't measure up. San Shin Khan could slice anything except Van and his sword, because Jin made it. With this in hand, he can finally swing without hesitating. Then he can't stop wondering if he powers up. Can he actually land the hit? The girl pushes him to keep going, and Kalaf tells him to give everything he's got, even if the odds try to crush him. He thought he was surrounded by two stunning roses. Then Lidere snapped, calling out to him. He claimed the material in that book had been completely misunderstood. He told them he had 7 days to reach the Temple of Thermisto, the island sitting south of the Kovian Peninsula, and he swore he'd get the book he needed. The young man figured he had just 7 days to scrape together cash for a new book. Then someone pointed out, with a grin, that he'd already planted way too much for it to be that simple. Pao promised her help for the harvest, and Ish jumped in too, asking for a treat in return. And he just couldn't believe it. They loved bread and salt, so refusing Pal's help was downright foolish, especially since he was the one who kept the land and harvest running. Then he demanded, How could spirits wearing human faces only eat whatever they personally feel is tasty? They told me, we go after what pulls at us, the stuff that hooks our interest. And the local harvest is straight up fascinating. They say this place is the city of Narwadid. The protagonist declared the truffle pasta was pure bliss. And honestly, you could see why Narwadid was hailed as a progressive city. Jean told the guy he'd teleported all the way here just to hawk the demon fox's horns and skin because they sold for way more than in Canem, and the man praised the goods as top tier. Jin practically thought his money crisis was fixed, but there was still one more thing left to do. He figured he needed a sword like Zanzikin, but nothing fit the bill, so he finally shrugged and said, maybe this one will have to do. The seller swore he had spirit weapons, and when the guy pressed him again, he broke it down. These weren't regular blades. They were weapons haunted by a spirit, forged by one, or even a spirit that got transformed into steel. And it hit him. Zanzikin wasn't just a sword. It was a spiritual weapon, too. The man insisted the blade's power rises or falls with your spirit's strength, and there's no upkeep to worry about. The merchant swore he could stash it anywhere the spirit wanted, or even in a shrine. And the young man couldn't stop thinking, was his Zanzikin just locked away forever? Did he have to pull it out now and then? And why did nobody ever give him a single instruction? The main character leaned in and demanded they show him, and he realized these were the very golden ranks Amadeo led, the ones Letze had been talking about, so he begged the spirits to stay out of the way, just so he could finally catch a glimpse. Jin figured he was stuck surrounded by girls. Then someone told him he'd be teaming up with a magician, and yeah, he had other stuff to do, but fear still clawed at him that he'd missed the moment. He was sure each of them carried their own spirit robe-clad woman, the sorceress, burning with the light element, while the archer breathed wind and greenery through a bow wrapped in living tree branches like a spiritual weapon. The boy figured this was the very Amadeo Letza had warned him about, and his spirit felt jumpy like a prairie dog on alert. The young man stared at the prairie dog and blurted, "What continent are you from?" Then, his brain exploded with questions, and just as fast, he started wondering where Ash and the others had vanished to. The young man snapped to it. They were working together. All right, Oz, the chin lover, and Dean's spirit, the butler's spirit, had to be lurking nearby. And on their last expedition, Dean's spirit had gone straight for his boots. So he decided right then to leave his spirits behind on them, just in case. And he just couldn't figure it out, why she was grinding up against his stubble like spirits had the wildest cravings. And like, let's say, couldn't exactly muster a protest. The protagonist figured gold-ranked spirits had to be terrifyingly strong, and that black spirits wouldn't even scratch them. Then he watched them anyway, only to realize they were squaring off against monitor lizards. The guy couldn't shake the feeling that this adventurer, one of the punitive group, was downright strange. Jin was sure that even though she was an archer, she could still throw down up close, and then he saw the adventurer shaking with a black spirit. But the moment he tried to step closer, she hurled him back, and he realized she was back for real. He figured that once a spirit grabbed a body, it couldn't keep its power without it, and he couldn't stop wondering if there were rules or conditions that decided when someone could get possessed. I couldn't believe how calm that girl looked. I figured she had to know about the black spirit. But then I started freaking out, wondering how the heck anyone was supposed to beat it. The young man snapped that the only way through was to forge a contract, but he was almost sure spiritual weapons would crush them while the hero stared, wondering if she really meant it, before trailing off without finishing. The young man figured he shouldn't be shocked. This world barely treats human life like anything, and cruelty runs rampant. But then he finally caught a glimpse of death up close for the first time. He figured ordinary folks can't even see or touch spirits, but if the container gets cracked while a spirit's trapped inside, the spirit pays the price too, and that's why he couldn't understand why she didn't go after the black spirit when it finally broke free. Then bam, someone else burst onto the scene. The protagonist watched a black spirit slither into his friend, and the whole room went cold. He figured the archer couldn't spot the black spirit. So he leaned into the truth. Spirits aren't seen the same way by everyone. Some only catch colored flickers, while others only perceive spirits tied to specific elements or powers. Jin figured he could finally see the spirits crawling into people, but this time he wasn't fully claimed. He was only half possessed like the thing needed time, and he couldn't stop wondering, could those two gold-ranked monsters see him too? He remembered Letzi warning that Amadeo could see them, but spotting a spirit hiding inside a human body was a whole different beast. She'd even said that if they'd recognized him, they'd have yanked him away from the others. And who knows, if they'd have clocked him at all in the state he was in right now. The young man decided he didn't have to solve it. But he'd learned too much to panic. Now he felt like he could handle it. And he begged the spirit of shadow and the spirit of light to hide his face completely and lift his body 10 centimeters off the ground. The young man demanded they keep the hood locked tight and make sure his legs never showed. The main character finally snapped and decided it was time to go. Amadeo leaned in and demanded to know what the hell was going on here. She admitted she was totally lost until this guy suddenly popped up and begged her for forgiveness. Everyone hit the floor with shock when they finally found out where he came from and who he truly was. He figured that even if he introduced himself, they'd still never clock who he was unless somehow it was these guys. And he begged the spirit of sound to reshape his voice. Jin told him to ignore it and go after this guy because Jin needed something from him, and when he pressed him again, he was terrified. He rammed his fingers into the boy's body, and for a second he swore he'd imagined the whole thing. And he snatched the spirit with both hands, locking it in so it couldn't slip away. The sorceress snapped, asking if he was possessed, then said another man had attacked him. The battered adventurer was still breathing somehow against all odds. Everyone's jaw dropped when he finally woke up. They all stared in disbelief, like there was no way he'd actually bounced back. And then the girl blurted, "Who are you?" She asked about the spirits hovering around him, and the young man remembered right now they were free. The last thing he ever wanted was to draw attention, so he usually told them to stay back. But tonight he needed their help, and he couldn't shake the feeling she could see them too. The young man said he had no clue where the black spirit came from, but first it latched onto the wounded boy and warned them to tread carefully. The protagonist felt like Ash was staring right at him, yet he was certain she couldn't possibly spot him. Amadeo roared for him to stop, but the second those words left his mouth, poof, he teleported out of reach. He figured he'd finally gotten everything under control. Jin gripped the black spirit like it was still alive in his hands, swore he had to seal the contract and hurl it deep into the forest, and realized it was the biggest spirit he'd ever laid eyes on. He swore that horse was a giant black spirit, but he clenched his nerves, steadied his breath, and had no choice but to muscle through with pure brute force. The young man stared into the truth. Black spirits didn't just prey on others, they devoured their own kind, either to regrow what was missing or to recharge their strength, and it all pointed to one brutal fact they kept feeding, nonstop, on their own. And then it hit him. The horse had warned that once he signed the contract, the power drain would ease, the hunger for power would still burn, but the pain would vanish, letting his spirit finally steer itself. So he clung to that, thinking this was how he stopped the devouring of other spirits, and he believed he could finally go home. The young man swallowed his fear, steadied his voice, and told them, "We've been working our tails off, so what happened to you?" The protagonist couldn't stop thinking, why am I even apologizing? When, right in front of them, the archer realized one of the others was possessed by a spirit and nearly wiped that guy out. When Ash and the others finally came back, the guy knew he had to fire off even more questions. Джин попросив його роздягнутися, і це дуже його налякало. He said he'd handle the laundry and even offered to swap out her clothes, and she told him the kids would be out tending the cattle while she and her husband worked the fields, asking if it was fine if she got all dirty. Jin shot back that he'd been planning to give her to them anyway. The man was totally baffled and blurted out why he was being bothered so early and whether Shiva was behind it. Then she told him they'd wash him at the well, dress him, and he pleaded, "Don't you ignore me." The young man snapped, "All right, let's get going," and then revealed that he'd come to their house today for a very specific reason. And for the past few days, he'd been studying right alongside masons and carpenters. Then the more he learned, the more sickening details he uncovered. The place was full of unsanitary mess, and even the entrance doors were set higher so rain wouldn't wash street grime into the house. That young man snapped with fury. Sure, they'd clean up the horse manure, but why not turn it into compost or even fuel? The protagonist looked at this and thought, so even the dinosaur family sleeps on straw, tucked under cloth. Meanwhile, other farmers were just crashed out on plain straw or right in the barns, and it hit him that out here in the world, so many people were only trying to survive the day and the moment. He finally clocked the truth. He didn't have the itch to micromanage everything all the time, but at the very least, he wanted the people around him, his friends and acquaintances, to keep things clean, so he set out to figure out exactly how. Gene finally decided the dinosaur family deserved some credit by local standards. They kept things pretty clean, and honestly, a few other farmers were decent too, but their homes were such a wreck that he didn't even want to step inside. The man practically shouted that he was a cleaning genius, then admitted he'd done everything he could. Now all that was left was fixing the door. Dinosaur promised he'd watch over her tomorrow and pulled them in for tea, and the parents told the kids to clean the quail and go grab the eggs again. They nodded in agreement, and then someone leaned in and asked the hero, "So do you actually like cleaning?" The young man snapped back that he hated it, so the man demanded, "Then why'd you do it?" He fired back that the filthy conditions lit a fuse in him, so he stormed there in pure rage, and Shiva just grinned, saying he loved cleanliness more than anything. The man swore this was quail and green onions, slow stewed with liquor. Shiva's signature dish, and the genie's eyes lit up, calling it delicious. He agreed, quail was great on its own. But once you tossed in onions in that booze-rich stew, it didn't just taste good, it went straight to divine. People say the dish starts by simmering quail and green onions in a sweet liqueur that stopped fermenting, yet the sugar stays locked in. So a young man jumped at the chance and started tossing it into his own recipes. The woman swept everyone to the table and pulled them in. Everyone clinked cups and shouted, "Bon appetit," but he couldn't care less. Warm food around family meant nothing to him, because in his eyes, the dinosaur family was the real definition of family. And he couldn't stop wondering, could he ever build that same cozy hearth they had with someone he still hadn't managed to reach a real agreement with? They told him this was Thermisto Island, and sure, he'd heard it was famous for lace and fancy silverware, but before he got distracted, he figured he should hit the temple first, and that building Voudry mentioned had to be somewhere around here. The young man swallowed his pride, apologized, and said someone had told him he had books. They said, "It's you, same black hair, same violet eyes," and grilled him. "So you're the one Mr. Ladari warned about." The hero nodded and said, "He told me to come here." And the older man's face lit up like he'd had the same revelation. And he couldn't help wondering, was this really a revelation? Or was it just him spilling everything right to his face? He gripped his attention and ordered, "Follow me now." Jin spotted a stone statue of Looter, and the man immediately demanded he swear right then and there that Jin would never tell a soul what he'd seen inside. A young man thrust his oath into the air. He spotted a secret door tucked away like it was hiding a huge secret. And I swear this kid instantly reminded me of Ludare. So I blurted out, "Who are you?" Blue hair, bright blue eyes, nothing else even shows up. But the whole look still feels like it's screaming, "This is a loot drop." It wasn't a candle at all. Those tiny spirits were glowing like they'd lit the whole room. That spirit's just a kid, and if he can spot him without using his eyes, then this kid is seriously powerful. He demanded that he follow right behind him. It was stuffed to the brim with books, page after page stacked everywhere. Books that teach magic and summon spirit. And the hero couldn't stop himself. He had to know how that place was born. They made him read the instructions about the place and how to use it. And then, boom, he'd find the books he needed. So the hero thanked the guide. Every clue was right there, waiting for him to spot it. Long ago in the Southern Empire, an emperor was so obsessed with books, he squeezed them out of merchants like they were treasures, then monsters and dragons smashed into his land. And when the library was about to turn to ash, Luderi ripped it away and moved it before it could burn. After a while, the kid transformed into the library's very spirit, and that's why he looks just like him. The heroes had the same power as Rufus, and it left him staring like, what are they hiding? Right ahead of him sat a history book, every page screaming their story. Long ago, legends say, a band of brave people carved out the kingdom of Pasa and made it their own. These roof people weren't just surviving, they were protected by the spirits. And even with a tiny population, they forged a shockingly strong state. Then everything crumbled after a brutal fight for the throne, and fresh invasions from other nations. The ones who didn't get saved by the spirit formed their own kingdom, led by a queen who'd survived the roof, and from that day on, they proudly called themselves the Roof People. The moment the state crumbled, the whole royal family was wiped out. So basically, there were two kinds of roofs, one for the Roof People, tied to the Pasta Kingdom, and another for the Roof People tied to the Roof Kingdom, and yeah, the Roof People could talk to spirits too, just not as smoothly as the other group, who were said to be born from the spirits themselves. They rebuilt the country by tracking down one of the Roof People. And that had him absolutely hooked because he loved that library and couldn't wait to visit it again and again. The hero spotted Ash and the moment felt electric because it had been ages since they'd last crossed paths. Her hair clung to her face as she sank into a steamy bath. I hated it when the ash got wet. He bragged he could make water boil on command if she asked, but she snapped back that she couldn't ask him. Her looks were so rough it made you feel weird just stepping inside. The hero got it. He finally understood her. After he finally crawled into a bath on that island, it was packed with nasty surprises, flies, bugs, and grime everywhere, so the shower turned into a nightmare. And their expedition dragged on way longer too, judging by how many people showed up. And yeah, it's pretty unlikely, but she still somehow got the chance to bathe in the river. He promised he'd get the water boiling, and then shot a question: where the heck was the butler? Ash told her he was stuck doing laundry and promised he'd swing back later. But she burst out that she couldn't take it anymore and apologized for dragging her into it. Then the hero jumped in, said he'd whip up some tea, and told her to hang tight until the bath was finally ready. He pressed a cup of tea into her hands and told her to take a sip. She thanked him and told him to back off, because she could still smell the stench clinging to her. The hero didn't buy what she was saying, and if that's what she wanted, he refused to come anywhere near her. Ash shoved souvenirs into his hands, one after another. He shot her a quick thank you and leaned in, asking what exactly was in there. His sword was forged from plain iron. But the real magic kicked in because it was coated with magic ore mixed the two together, and it turns way stronger. The hero shot her a grateful look and said the material was priceless, then leaned in and asked how she was faring in the forest. Ash admitted she'd already run into a man out there who looked just like him. Jin's stomach dropped; she might spot his face. He blurted, "What's that man like?" The girl claimed he traveled with spirits, then she managed to catch him. And that's when she decided he had to be a genuinely kind person. There was this unsettling aura around him, like his powers kept shifting and rewriting themselves the second you looked away. It's because the spirits are working overtime under that cloak. In the strike team, there was a man haunted by a black spirit, and the deeper they pushed forward, the more wrong, twisted, and downright abnormal he became. Soon, he lunged at Nina, the gold-ranked archer, and she didn't just dodge, she fought back hard. But right after that, a spirit surged to try and take over someone else, and the hero figured they had no clue the black spirit was watching. As soon as it slips into someone's body, it's almost impossible to spot your own aura and magic swallow it up. And it's even got the Rose Sorceress completely fooled. The guy leaned in and demanded where that man had snagged the black spirit. The girl snapped that he should have already heard about the war in the Central Plains, where one of those tiny countries unleashed a massive magical strike. This war dragged on for ages, so the last surviving spirits tried to stay far away. But that Taka's birth sparked a monstrous cloud of black spirits. Jin told them, "Even if you can't see the spirits, you should know black ones will wreck everything." This isn't the first time we've seen it before. Most of the wounded spirits bolted, streaking off to settle their revenge right then and there. But the kingdom still couldn't pull off a decent harvest that year. Rose said that the guy who looked like a genie might actually be a descendant of the Roof People. The hero felt crushed by the idea that everyone was misreading him, and he was insisting he had nothing to do with it. The butler swallowed his pride and apologized for keeping everyone waiting. He asked if there'd be enough firewood, and the boy nodded back, "Yeah," then thanked him for bringing it along. The man demanded they thank him, and even those aristocrats couldn't claim comfort like what they had in his own house. His soap was rock hard and smelled nothing like an animal, totally shocking. The guy grinned and told Ash that once he was done, he could take his sweet time and soak in the tub while he baked up some goodies. He had time to whip up a meat pie while the cookies were already baked, and then the hero decided to go for a sponge cake next. He told them he'd heard rumors about a roof-like creature lurking in the forest. Then Lady Rose clocked it instantly, and the truth hit hard. Her deduction was rooted in a nasty past tied to the very kingdom that called the heroes in. The man figured she wasn't chasing answers. She was hunting the one person who could finally confront the kingdom. People whispered that the Ruth descendants lived for ages, but he always brushed it off as a fairy tale, until her theory hit him with real hard sense. Jin felt like he didn't belong with them, so he told everyone he was stepping away from the guild. For now, he didn't want to drag Rose and the others into trouble. The butler snapped that he was right, and that it'd be a disaster if he begged Ms. Ash for help, since she can see spirits. They planned to head back after a quick break, so she'd be totally fine sitting out the expedition. The guy pushed for booking a quest for Ash, and with her attitude, she'd almost certainly go for the first request. He figured the best move was to step right up to the Rose and blurt, "I'm not a roof," but that sounded like way too much hassle. The hero whipped the base until the dessert turned light and fluffy. You had to bake it slow and keep flipping it non-stop, turning constantly so it wouldn't burn. The girl leaned in and demanded to know what he was cooking. It was a fluffy sponge cake, and he also whipped up a hearty meat pie. The boy promised, "We'll eat the moment the butler is done washing himself." The hero grinned because his comrades loved every single thing. They absolutely nailed it. Today's the long-awaited banquet to celebrate their triumphant return, and man, everything on the table looked insanely delicious. The man shrugged, like it was nothing, and admitted he'd already forgotten just how mind-blowing beef could taste. He swore freshly cooked meat was pure heaven, and once the mission kicked off, they munched jerky and monster meat to keep moving. But that still didn't explain why they piled on so much meat, like it was trying to start a war at the dinner table. Ash couldn't stop wondering if they actually served meat pies there, and she totally proved she was into his meat pie. He said that night was crawling with three-legged, two-horned things, but the real nightmare was the black demons turning out to be wolves. Black demons are monsters with jet-black spots circling their eyes, and the darkness can stretch even farther, but not all of them are the same, with some variations boasting rounder horns and eyes that don't carry that black spill at all. Once that black spreads over their bodies, every flaw vanishes, and in its place they rise as stunning monsters from that moment on. The spirit fully devours their bodies, forging them into something insanely powerful, and no matter how you count it, their numbers keep on growing. It turned out way worse than anyone expected, but the guild somehow saw it coming, so they shipped 3 gold-ranked soldiers to handle it. The rose didn't just sit there, it wore a gold rank. He couldn't shake the gut feeling that another country was unleashing that brutal rose magic, and with everyone buzzing about summoning heroes in Shulma, it had to be all tied together. The brutal war tears everything apart, and then the summoning of heroes hits like the world's last desperate move. Next time, Amadeo will rally every strong adventurer in the country, and this time, it's going to kick off the biggest raid in years. The butler leaned in and asked if the two of them had been invited to join his group. He claimed he'd been invited, then snapped it off because it wasn't his business and told Chris to handle it. As a knight, he'll grant a pretty face a wish, but he'd still rather be the head of a dog than the tail of a lion. And Ash drew the line. Thank goodness the hero pushed them to dig into the roots of those medicinal herbs. He claimed nobody had ever invited him. Jean snapped that their take was straight up not very insightful. He mistook it for a compliment. Then the hero double-checked everything and realized they weren't talking fluff at all. It looked like they were hunting people who had perfume. Amadeo's followers didn't just follow, they caused chaos wherever they went. After they found out he'd rejected the offer, one thing was crystal clear: he never shut anyone out. They sent him off with a burst of hope and shouted for luck. The hero got an invite to join, but he snapped back. No way was he sleeping in the forest and stumbling into trouble. They're saying the guild handed out gold-ranked genie bags, and now orders are flooding in, non-stop. He bowed and thanked the gold ranks, then hurried straight to the Adventurers Guild. Jean leaned in and asked her straight up, "So are you really selling the Fox Lane house?" Fox's End is the street that funnels right into the alley by his house, and the Ash's house too, and the butler says the place next door has only just gone empty. He said it straight. He was just dying of curiosity about the kind of people who'd actually want to buy it. The girl told him, "Hold on just a minute." Even though the hero only tossed the question out casually, the girl leaned in and asked, "So want to buy a house?" The hero said only a silver-ranked adventurer or someone hired can buy a house. And then they told him the Merchant Guild and the Healer Guild could hook him up with a recommendation. He figured, I must be moving a ton of stuff, and that's why people trust him. Someone told him he could either grab his current house or trade up for a better one down the street. He said he loved his current place and was ready to buy it, but the girl snapped back that the house down that street was up for sale. Right now, the Merchant Guild controls it, and they're lining it up for short-term rentals until the Adventurers' Raid is finally done. Nobody in their right mind would risk buying a house on the wall's deadliest edge while the strike force was still being assembled. The girl told him Amadeo was hunting for someone, and after that raid, he'd almost certainly stay in the city while his house got handed over and rented out to his trusted men like it was a locked-up secret. Rage simmered in the hero's chest over that. He said he wanted to buy it. Then Jean snapped into action, promised to renovate the place and get it rented out. He decided to go big and buy 2 houses back-to-back, then immediately started pacing, asking himself where the renovation grind should begin. He stared at the back door and seriously considered slipping out through it. The hero stormed up, shook the man's hand, and greeted him like they'd been friends for years. He'd gone out to hunt, but with a whole swarm of adventurers crowding the town, he's calling it a day off because back when his gold rank held him back, it made things harder, yet now he can finally breathe easy and not fear the monster tide. They finally grabbed Dean and Chris too, because Ash went off bear hunting, and the guy claimed he knew it all, since they were his neighbors. The man leaned in and demanded, "Tell me if you hear about any good housing deals." The hero thought he was finally moving, like the world couldn't hold him down anymore. After he finally hit the silver rank, he told himself he'd earned the right to buy a house, then admitted he still hadn't made up his mind. Unlike the genie, he went through the entire ritual the right way, from the very first step to the final one. He leaned in and asked what he was doing tomorrow, then said he needed to request something first. The hero blurted at him to hang on to the doorframe. The man lit up and said it was awesome that he and Ash finally had their own places, then leaned in and asked if they were thinking of renting out rooms. Jin had heard that anyone rolling into town usually grabbed a tiny room and shared a well. But because he ran a medicine business, he refused to share that well. There were too many secrets clinging to his chest, and he craved freedom. But the second other people showed up, he threw that selfish urge aside and stepped in to help them. The hero leaned in and demanded, "So tell me, what kind of house do you want to buy?" I'm saying, let's say, snapped back that he'd rather have a 3-story place with a shop downstairs than rent out the attic and the 3rd floor to bring in even more cash. The guy leaned in and demanded what he planned to do with the store. The man shrugged and said it all hinged on the wife, and when the hero heard that, he froze, shocked he was married. Letsa shrugged and admitted he doesn't have a wife yet, saying folks usually wait until they buy a house before they get married. Jin leaned in and asked, "Who do you have in mind?" The man shot back that nobody was there because he'd poured every free moment into getting ready for work. With that, the whole conversation about love died out. He said his cooking was still just as amazing. Then the guy shrugged and claimed the tart bite comes straight from the tomatoes, capers, and olives. Let's blurted out what tomatoes were. And the hero's mind went totally blank, like he suddenly realized he'd never seen them there before. Jean shot him a warning, "Don't you dare grab some strange food without checking first." He couldn't wrap his head around why it had to be done, and snapped that everything was already fine if the hero had just prepared it. He was totally flattered, but it still left him feeling awkward all over. Let's find out what's been chewing at him. Jean shot back that the gold ranks and their swarm of minions had him genuinely worried because they were stirring up trouble everywhere. The heroes refused to team up with them. This could blow up in his face the second they learn he can actually see spirits. The guy nodded and admitted the man was right. Then it hit him like the world suddenly came into focus. He couldn't explain it, but somehow he just knew he was the kind of person who could see spirits. The man leaned in and asked whether he was actually interested in how he managed to guess it. He said Chris always tossed nicknames at anyone who could see spirits, even though nobody ever caught on, not even Chris himself. Now that I think about it, he never once used Ash's first name. He always slapped on some nickname instead. All you had to do was ask, "Chris, say his name like you mean it." He seemed like trouble at first, but he was a solid dude. And the protagonist insisted he wasn't a bad person. Chris kept getting sent on jobs by aristocrats because Dean refused to touch that mess. So Chris always stepped in and bailed him out. And yeah, that's why he turned out to be the real good guy. But the guy was so loud, the hero had to dodge around him to get away. He's got this razor-sharp intuition, and it's a real shame that Chris never even realized that kind of talent was already inside him. He said that if he finally spilled the truth, the guy would get it because he could actually see spirits. But yeah, only the hero knows every last secret. Jin flat out said, "It isn't a secret at all if the person who matters has no clue." He cornered the guy and asked what he should do. But the man swore he was just nervous, and the hero flat out told him not to enjoy it. He told me straight up that Chris had the real firepower to pull this off. Now he knew for sure because the genie finally admitted he'd been fooled the whole time. It was pure manipulation. This guy pulled the strings and told him, "Don't worry. He'll keep the gold ranks in line, and the hero can count on him whenever things get rough." He guessed they had different life experiences, or that he was really trying to grow that beard for a specific reason. He tended the vegetable garden, slipped supplies to the strike group along the route, and then uncovered exactly what they were up to. Me and Sesh teamed up to build a cure for the yellow spot epidemic, and it turned out to be insanely rare. So rare it lit a fire under the Merchant Guild. Once the plumbing system gets installed on Fox Lane, that house is going to need repairs, and he's got a mountain of work to tackle. Before anything else, he had to pretend he was a roof. After that, city after city rushed to form strike teams and started stalking targets deep in the forest, and every local guild traded intel the same way through spirits. Using that opening, he slinks through the forest in rough disguise on purpose, then starts spreading word about himself. He finally got his hands on exactly what he needed. Right in front of him stood the adventurers from the Citadel. A 2-horned wolf and a 3-legged badger closed in from both sides, leaving them no room to breathe. And then owls and bats swooped in, and a massive bear tore through the scene. The hero couldn't figure out where all those monsters were spawning from because the forest was packed to the brim, and suddenly the hunters and their prey had flipped roles. Kinda couldn't shake the worry that the Citadel barely ever sent out exploration teams. The hero whipped out his healing skill, and the man's face lit up with pure shock. The guy leaned in and told him, "Take it all on yourself, shoulders the whole burden." They pressed him for his name, and the man shot back a thank you like it was the final piece of the puzzle. The adventurers immediately started blurring out apologies, insisting over and over that it was all their fault. The hero got fed up, turned around, and popped up in place after place to warn everyone. Ruth was blazing north, then west, straight for the Black Mountains, while the spirits worked to trick Rose and the other golden ranks, so they'd stay clueless, and he could lose them in the dark. He brewed a crimson potion, and then dared to act like a roof. The hero whips his head toward the butler. Jean told everyone he was in desperate need of a fresh haircut. The man snapped that he couldn't help, and the hero's whole mood crumpled with that refusal. Letsa shot him a worried look and asked if he was okay because he'd suddenly decided to get a haircut, and even asked for money. Jean admitted it wasn't about that at all. He just didn't want to deal with a barber, so he figured the butler could handle the job. He hated getting his hair cut in those barber shops inside the bathhouse hygiene reasons, and he would not let it slide. I told you his hair is gorgeous, and cutting it would be a total waste. He didn't take care of them at all, so the local water probably wrecked everything still. Their shine looked like it stood out on its own. Back then, aristocrats kept their hair long like it was the height of style, so the hero could have just left his alone. But the boy groaned that washing it was pure misery. He couldn't stop thinking about shaving them off. The man promised he'd trim his hair later, like he didn't have to go full monk. But Jin's jaw dropped anyway when he realized he'd just heard his thoughts. They've only just met, but he's weirdly easy to read, like he sees right through things. The butler pitched the idea of hiring a servant, but it sounded bizarre, like someone was just going to hire help to wash and dry his hair. His comrades burst in, slammed into the moment, and greeted him like the hero they'd been waiting for. They already tore through the assignment and wrapped it up. They demanded he lug a barrel of wine over, and the hero muttered to himself that their endless racket was driving him insane. The butler praised them to the heavens and then leaned in, asking how Amadeo's squad was holding up. He shot back that all three deserved that gold-rank title, then flexed his strength, and the other two immediately piled on the compliments. Chris admitted it. He'd been jealous of their spiritual weapons, and deep down, he couldn't help but hope she'd love him too someday. The protagonist said it felt like the desperate plea of a lonely man, trapped in his own silence. That was the expression, because just grabbing a spiritual weapon isn't the win. If you wield it right, then you've earned the title of beloved spiritual weapon. Those usual hanger-ons were basically useless. All they cared about was climbing the ranks for free. Jin was convinced he'd made the right call by shutting it down and refusing. And now it's revealed 4 heroes have finally shown up, and the Empire seems to let them do whatever they want. He heard it straight from his people, so don't you dare assume they're harmless. The genie's sister and her crew weren't the only heroes, because out there someone else was ready to step in. The gods stayed silent, like they refused to mess with the pact the Ball of Light had forged, because she hadn't even seen the ones they summoned. Not once. And he knew nothing about his sister's powers, save for whatever that ball accidentally let slip. Even the strongest heroes usually ease into spirit collecting, with weak prayers and soft magic first. But these 4 just blew past all the rules. He heard a wild rumor spreading through the West. Fewer and fewer people are still able to see spirits. Ash couldn't shake the thought, nobody ever warned them. You don't come across folks like that out of nowhere. There were barely any, and they were told that was it. The last time these heroes showed up was 300 years ago, and ever since then, the ties between them and the world around them have been a mystery that never lets up. Back then, years before the guild ever guessed it, everything spiraled into overflow risk way sooner than predicted, and Chris bluntly pointed out that the magic unleashed in last year's war was even bigger than anyone expected. They told him this had no reason at all, and that crushed him the most, because it felt like every problem in the world detonated in a single moment. Dean promised, no more dark talk, we're leaving it all behind. He challenged the protagonist to a drinking contest, and the kid stood there dumbfounded, thinking, why me? Why am I the one getting picked? Dean told the hero, win and I'll escort you to the House of Lunar Pleasures, but lose, and I'll spill one filthy secret, Chris shot back. Then I'll play 2 win, and you're getting swept into heavenly bliss. Jean just stood there, totally lost. These were the top-tier brothels places, so exclusive you couldn't even step inside without a recommendation. The guy shrugged off those bets and demanded they call him by his first name, and Ash immediately fired back that he wanted the same treatment. He refused to bring up brothels with Ash around, and the butler looked just as uncomfortable. Ash warned that cutting through the space between 2 brothels in this class would be downright rude. The butler thought she should halt right there, and he tried to make her beg for pity. Jean figured they were already half-wrecked with booze. Then the butler never even began yet. Somehow that man jumped in and started playing anyway. So they had to haul these 2 upstairs and leave them there. The man admitted he never saw it coming. The hero could hold his liquor like a champ. Thanks to the treatment, the guy only managed a small, shaky burst of cheer, like hope cracking through. The butler promised he'd clean everything up. then asked for the ash to be taken. The hero swore he'd walk her home himself. Like Cobb too, the man leaned in and said, "Trust me, this is one strange sight you've got to see to believe." Jean asked if she could walk on her own, and the girl shot back that she was totally fine. The hero regretted it. Instantly, he should have stayed there too, not left it all to the butler. A massive wall stood right in front of her, blocking every way forward. Ash shot back that she already knew, and that's when everyone realized she was totally drunk. He stood right beside her, close enough that it felt like the air changed. He figured the only path she could take right now was to charge straight forward. Jin leaned in and asked, "Is everything really okay?" The girl spun around to face the main character. He couldn't make heads or tails of her. She was spitting out these weird, impossible words. He had no clue how to talk to drunk people without making everything explode. Her sharp features melted into something gentler, and her shoulders looked suddenly fragile. A single look, everything shifted. Jin leaned in and told her, Please don't get drunk in public anymore, it's dangerous." Men act like it's nothing, but she could seriously use a hangover cure. The main character leaned in and demanded to know how she was really feeling. She looked rough, and the hero hurried over with bread and sausages, only for the girl to confess her stomach was a little off. He swore he'd use their kitchen. Jin whipped up a fiery syrup, blending ginger with bright citrus for a kick that hit like lightning. It hit hard, but somehow still tasted sweet enough. He told her it'd calm her stomach for good, so she had to chug a ton of water and crash and rest. Ash thanked him, then snapped into an apology like, "I'm sorry I dragged you into all this trouble." The hero said he'd head home if everything was fine. Then the girl yanked him to a stop and declared she was taking him to the spirit branch, just like she promised, because she wanted to repay him for every one of his experiments. He still remembered their first meeting. She was about to give him a tour, and he had zero urgent stuff to deal with. They finally struck a deal. She felt like herself again today. Finally, the pain had backed off for good. Azu wore a bright, content grin like nothing in the world could touch him, and her face looked exactly the same as it always did. The hero told me he'd been there before just to grab water for his potions. This is the very same branch of spirits where Dean's sister spirit was ripped out of him. So yeah, guess what? They showed up. The spirit branch always sat in the boldest spot in the square, right out in the open. And sure enough, Kanuma wasn't special, because every city did the same thing. There were workrooms and the caretaker's quarters here, but the courtyard was set somewhere else entirely. Every drop of water was tied to the spirits like it was one more branch on the king's own chain. The branch was right there, and everyone called it the spirit branch, so he thought about asking her again, but it felt like everyone in town already knew, and he swallowed the question and stayed quiet. He hadn't dug deep into the spirit branch yet right now. He was laser-focused on the spirits themselves and the world's history, but the Azir didn't have a king branch, and the Khanum branch was just a pseudo-branch. Azur was the country where the Khanum was hiding, so when she said it, she was basically telling him the branch was a total fake. The king's branch is no ordinary tree. It's the spirit tree, the great spirit tree, the holy center of everything, and to reach it, you've got to smash through every nightmare, stand before the sacred tree, and swear an oath that becomes the very foundation of the country. Good vibes filled this branch, and every last evil spirit got chased off, yet the hero still didn't know much, and when they finally met, he admitted it right away. The spirit tree is way smaller than the king's tree, but it hits just as hard. Getting to it is brutally hard, like ripping up a sacred oath, and if you break that vow, you lose both the king's tree and the spirit tree. Sermutus, Pastor, and Marina, those three alone cracked the secret and truly inherited the king's bloodline. The land where his sister lives and the place where Nero Edit sits. He knows zero about the kingdom of Pastor, and he's got a sick feeling the fake Khanum branch is already pulling strings. That fake branch was soaked in magic, powered by magical stones that formed a cozy magic field for spirits. And sure, you can craft it in a regular temple, but getting it done is anything but easy. The guy shrugged and said it sounded like way too much work. They hucked magic stones into the water and watched the ripples explode outward. He couldn't stop wondering how long they could keep summoning spirits when magic stones were so rare and so pricey. So he shot back, "Can you do it with pure magic alone, no spirit branch?" The girl warned that whoever hands over that magical force along with the magic stone's element will inevitably shake the spirits lurking nearby. But the pseudo-branch smothers the whole effect, letting the magic unravel and fade into the air. The very first spirit burst into existence. The spirits drenched themselves in water, then turned every drop into healing potions. At night, they sparked a flame instead of using a bowl of water, then saved the ashes for blacksmithing because they worked easier than before. They even tossed the ashes on the ground to make the soil richer, and the boy couldn't wait to catch sight of the spirit branch after dark. Ash offered, "If you want, we can go back there again." and Jin shot her a grateful thank you. The hero daydreamed about a date until she looked in the mirror and realized she suddenly looked more like a guy. She stopped frowning, and suddenly beauty lit up her face like it was magic. It came out perfect, baked to absolute perfection. Even the garden itself seemed to thrive, like every plant was beating the odds. He planted local veggies, and the ones he'd scavenged from his pantry then crushed under the fact that the pantry crops only thrived up in the mountains, because even with a desperate shot at it, artificial pollination was just too delicate for his hands. The spirits of peas, cabbage, and Italian parsley have arrived. Now the fields are filled with them, and every single vegetable shows off its own wild, unique personality. The guy snapped, "Onions are poison to dogs," and the man shot back, "Then Rich isn't a dog either." Looter burst onto the scene out of nowhere. Rich, still clinging to you as his master, and somehow still loving you like crazy. He probably couldn't stop thinking about how that puppy looked, and someone told the hero it was eating its good vegetables. He linked up with his pal, Ish. Ish was already out there, pouring water over the garden like he couldn't wait for it to bloom. Wherever Pal passed, the harvest seemed to burst ripe in his wake, like the whole place had turned into a fairy tale, powered by these three. He couldn't stop wondering what Ludere was up to, so he just stood there watching the dog in total silence. Jin pushed the idea to try the veggies he'd gathered, because he knew if they were curious, they could chow down on all kinds of flavors. The guy said he tipped in just a tiny bit, like a test run to see what would happen. Someone told him the taste was straight up delicious, and as fresh as it gets. He realized they were finally into it, and just like that, the ban on vegetables got lifted. Ludre leaned in and decided to try the onion. The hero grinned and told me he was already racing toward the scene. He shot his comrades a loud greeting and lit up the whole squad. They praised him for a job well done, and today, he proudly stepped up to present the renovated house. The guy told him, "Those dudes helped me like crazy," and the man snapped back, "Then we're painting 2 houses, no excuses." They waited what felt like forever, then finally threw themselves at him with apologies. After he bought the place, he handed control straight to his butler. Then the butler began screening every tenant who wanted to move in next door. Ever since they left the country, she's been hunted again and again. Assassins have tried to take her out so many times in her own lands. Jen promised to slash the rent and pay market rates for the work, because even with him volunteering for free, he wasn't about to let it be treated like charity. The butler pushed to rent him the house. After the first attack, housing prices shot up, and everything turned into a mess because now it's cheaper to live there only if you're brave enough to risk it. And if he'd picked a house, he'd have ended up with something he couldn't ever call home. He was lucky he managed to rent before the prices went wild. The hero figured if he snapped up a house, he must be hunting for a bride. Letza told her, "I don't need a wife yet," and Ash totally missed the message. Down on the ground floor, you've got a cozy living room, a bathroom, a kitchen, and even a storage room. The man couldn't believe a bathtub was even there. And the toilet didn't look like some random hole in the floor, because the guy was convinced a toilet just couldn't be anything but a potty-shaped gap. Jean told him straight up if he wanted to live there, he'd have to meet their rules, bathe at least once a day, swap into clean clothes, and disinfect himself every single year. The man shot the boy a stunned look, because somehow he'd pulled off an insane amount during the mission, turning it all into a win, thanks to the vault and the spirits. But he couldn't say that out loud, so he shot back that it was stronger than it looked, because on the second floor, there were 3 rooms. He swore it felt incredibly soft, nothing like a straw mat at all. The hero yelled, "Ju, don't forget to air it out." The girl spotted a storage room, and the guy told her the door slid open like it had a mind of its own. It swung open from the side like a trap door snapping wide. Sliding doors could be yanked out any time. And in places where security mattered, nobody trusted them for long. The 3rd floor stood empty, just like the 2nd. And the basement was a full-on warehouse split into a bunch of separate rooms. But it was locked up tight, holding weapons inside for safekeeping. The hero pitched lunch, and the whole crew lit up, because that guy was a kitchen wizard, and every bite promised pure joy. He couldn't help but beam when he saw his comrades laughing and smiling. Every bite hit like pure fire, so delicious it felt unreal. Regular gin gets chopped, braised, toasted, or grilled, and that's why he's on edge. He can't tell if they're raving because it's insanely good, or because the taste is weirdly different. This time he tossed Amiga satake mushrooms into the gratin poisonous. Sure, but cooked right. They're fine, and they hit perfectly with that creamy sauce. The catch is they're deadly if mishandled. The toxin only gets scrubbed away by long cooking, and the fumes in the steam can still sicken you, so the ventilation has to be on, or it turns dangerous fast. Even in Japan, people can't resist trying foods that might poison them, and in this world, that same dangerous craving runs wild too. They devoured every bite, love at first crunch of the top crust, then pure creamy heaven inside. That soup tasted so good, it almost made him forget everything. Yet the hero still craved praise, and the moment he tried to scrub off the dirt and cleanse himself at once, it turned into a non-stop hell. Letsa said he needed a drink, but all he had was that light wine, and he refused to lug it home because dessert time was calling. Dvoretsky said it hit soft and airy at first, then just like that melted in his mouth. Most sweets end up hard because it keeps them easy to store and saves them from going bad. Jin couldn't forget the shock on their face the moment he flipped those sponge pancakes. Sweets were practically extinct, and what little showed up was mostly those giant, clunky chunks. Back then, bakers could whip up sweets only on special holidays, pure luxury stuff, while everyday folks stuck to bread, no exceptions. Even out there, locals were going wild for buttery baked goods drenched in sweet maple, while top-notch pastry chefs worked their magic nearby. The walled city apparently guarded its own syrup like a treasure. And yeah, while it burned a hole in your wallet, it still sat there on the shelves, ready for anyone to grab. Turns out they probably should have planted sugar maple trees, but yeah, it's way more complicated than that. Let's say he feeds you something light and salty, and the butler hands out those same light snacks again and again. Ash craved more, but the hero slammed the brakes on her hopes, insisting she first get better. The girl pleaded, "Don't you touch my brother." Someone warned her to stay out of it. For the first time in forever, the hero finally went to see his family. And then, boom, he walked right into this nightmare. The man demanded that she think about what would happen to her father and the rest if she dared disobey. Jean crouched down and asked the kids how they were feeling. The girl suddenly blurted, "Look, people just flooded in." And right then, her father stepped forward and started talking to them. They were stuck in the barn chatting when her mother slipped in, grabbed the moment, and ordered them to bolt. Then they hunted down her brother and snatched him up. He told them, "Go back to your parents and shut up no matter what happens." The man demanded he start talking, then the other warned that if he dared to resist, he'd go after his child. The protagonist knew it was already over for them because the whole family was in real danger. And just off to the side, the second wind hit too, and now he had to juggle both, because handling them at once was a nightmare. The man couldn't believe it. Everyone would have sworn the Wolf King was rock solid, not some total weakling. He stared at it like he'd seen it before, like the memory was clawing at his brain. The girl sighed and basically said, "We're doomed, bad luck just hit us." Jin couldn't figure out what was going on or why she was so insanely strong. She actually pulled it off. He watched the whole thing unfold with his own eyes. The man demanded they untie him right now. He juked at the last second, and somehow it didn't end nearly as bad as it looked. He had a spare potion tucked away, just waiting for the moment everything went wrong. The man threw out an apology for dragging him into this, but the hero snapped back that it wasn't on purpose. Then they told him his face looked painfully pale. That's the second time he's watched someone die. With all that chaos swirling around her, she crushed her attackers like it was nothing, then turned back to make sure her wife and kids were safe and sound. Like this kind of madness was just another day in that world. Still, she pushed forward with jaw-clenching determination, and if he'd had his way, he'd just knock that guy out. But the hero couldn't shake the fear that he might not be able to beat her. Maybe the perfect move was to knock them all out with magic, but the chaos in his head had him flustered, and he totally forgot he could do magic at all. Then the man started to answer. Then he revealed he had the storage skill too, and the hero's jaw basically dropped in shock. He could have cracked open that storage and grabbed what he needed. The kids started whispering that with his storage power, he could cram an entire table inside, because real storage is rare as lightning. And if the nobles ever got a whiff, they'd snatch him in a heartbeat. That was the perfect blessing for a merchant storage magic. The moment Anne was chosen in the temple, the spirit's gift got spread like wildfire, and people started hunting her non-stop. Things were already getting messy fast, and she and the others were packing up even as the chase closed in. So yeah, everything points to one brutal truth. They'll have to bail on this place, the hero's going to be sick of it. And that man snaps, "We're heading to the Canaan," because they're done running. He and his wife were legendary adventurers, and everyone knew their names. The hero figured that was exactly why the gods told him to head to the Canaan, where the aristocracy and the church held the least sway. Shiva was born into a noble family, but they ditched it all and hit the road as adventurers. So yeah, the hero couldn't wrap his head around why she agreed, and the guy just shrugged and said, "It's a long story." Back when they were adventurers, they never lost their edge. Now they can fend for themselves, even after they got forced to quit their jobs 4 years ago, the day the boy unlocked the vaulting skill. For the past 4 years, the adventurers have lived in remote hideouts, where everyone could track them down. But they pushed the kids to learn how to fend for themselves, just in case anything ever happened to them. They planned to head back to their old jobs because out there, all they had was farming and hunting, nothing else to chase. The kids were about to turn 8, and he couldn't shake the idea that they needed bigger horizons than that. He was convinced they weren't just any old farming family, they were different in every way, and that man was an absolute legend as a father. Dinosaur demanded the potion's price, and the hero waved him off like, "Don't stress, just trust me." The man promised, "If I can pay, I'll make sure it's done, no doubt." They broke the cash into tiny bags so every single person could make it to the city safely, because if they split it up, the kids could finally hire adventurers to carry them to the Kana. This wasn't pocket change, it was a mountain they'd been hoarding for years. The woman demanded to know where he found that potion, and he swore the genie handed it to him. Then he groaned an apology, asked her to whip up something to eat before they took off, and got busy cleaning up the street. The hero nailed exactly what he meant. And it made perfect sense. He didn't need to leave a single shred of evidence behind. She swallowed her pride, apologized for what went down, and then asked the guy if it caught him off guard. Jen admitted she was a little shocked, then told him, "Don't worry, I'll handle the food. You just make yourself useful and help the kids get ready." The hero pushed a plan right away. Split the food into portions so they could grab it and carry it out with them. Someone told him his cooking was beautiful, so mouthwatering it practically begged to be eaten. The girl said she'd learn to cook just as well, too. The boy said, "At this pace, her fiancé's going to cook rings around her." And the man snapped back, "And don't get any ideas she's not marrying anyone." The hero found the conversation weird, but the room felt warm and familiar, like he'd been here 100 times before. And hey, big thanks to those guys because they just got another horse. And that kid's skills are about to pay off big time. The hero leaned in and promised the girl they'd meet again. They'll stay in the Canum for a few years, then slip underground when the time is right. He felt like they'd be stuck there forever, until the god's words finally snapped back into his mind dungeons, and he'd totally forgotten that. Everything suddenly felt wrong, like it just didn't belong together anymore. The boy's vault was bursting at the seams, and the heroine couldn't stop herself from thinking, how in the world does this thing even work? His repository is the squirrel spirit. He shoved it behind his cheek. If you stare closely, you'll see a fire dragon spirit grilling the man, while his wife walks beside a sharp, icy female spirit. And the two of them, plus the boy, have signed contracts with these spirits. The hero stepped up and offered to walk with them, but they shut him down fast. He showed up in that backwoods nowhere, right in front of them. No horse, no escort, nothing. And it instantly felt kind of shady. Gene snapped that he wasn't a roofer, though his setup looked suspicious as hell. This trip could be a bit rough for the kids, but trust me, they'll power through it. He thought he knew just how strong he was, but he refused to lean on raw power. He wanted to prove he could handle it with his own hands. And honestly, they're friends, no question about it. When they reached the Canum, the guy shoved him toward the fox's dead end. The man shot him a grateful look and thanked him. When they finally reached the Kanam, the hero wasted no time. He had a mouth-watering meal on the table and a steaming hot bath ready, and he couldn't wait to see their faces light up. He'd escaped for a change of pace. Right now, he was in a city in the southeast, where people swear an ancient archaeological site still sits on top of an abandoned place. And the moment he set out for it, monsters surged into his path. Word hit the crowd that it had been ages since anyone had last seen that person. The hero couldn't figure out where the voices were coming from. Nothing was in sight, yet someone was definitely there, just out of view. He plunged straight into real trouble. Hundreds of woodlice swarmed across the scene, crawling everywhere like they owned the place. They bolted for freedom, yet they had no clue where to hide. The hero just had to try touching them, then they stung like pain itself, and he recoiled fast after he apologized. He decided it was better to leave the weak alone than bully them. The woodlice warned, "You don't even know who you're up against because we'll chew you to pieces." He couldn't stop himself. His hands kept groping at them. They were the spirits that fire people crushed and forced into these bodies just to survive. So yeah, they were probably black spirits, riding beetles like vessels. The woodlice bragged that they'd devour anyone who stepped into their territory, and when it was done, they acted like they felt absolutely nothing. Jean started plotting their extermination, and when they said he looked like a sage and stood out from everyone else, it only made the whole thing feel even more intense. Now they were stuck with empty stomachs, and the hero figured this was their first real meal in ages, so he pressed them and demanded to know where their leader was. They weren't just pieces of the same thing, they moved separately, yet somehow their thoughts locked in like one mind. Right in front of him loomed a massive, gleaming beetle, perfectly unblemished, like the usual kind of monster, with a solid uniform color from head to claw. Chances are, you're not dealing with a regular beast. You're staring down a monster on a whole higher tier. Turns out, it wasn't luck at all. It was pure intelligence. The one thing that kept every single one of them alive, all for one single purpose. The hero swallowed his pride, apologized, and admitted he should have drawn up the contract because leaving them alone felt painfully wrong. They'd once been one spirit, but now that the deal was sealed, it finally clicked, and the weight of their hunger hit hard. He regretted everything, then begged them, "Don't go after humans." The guy told them, "I don't stop you from defending yourselves if they step onto our territory. You can do whatever you've got to. And at the same time, no one's forced to step in. Let them fall one by one if they have to. Because as long as there's just a single survivor standing, they'll keep growing." Jane realized these monsters were way more dangerous than he'd guessed, and if he didn't kill every last one, they'd just regenerate and come back. The woodlice leaned in and told him, "Spot one of us, and you can share your magic." They said the spell would crush their hunger, wipe it clean, and make them stop eating people forever. It's all because of his freedom skill. He can unchain spirits from that stuff. And now the woodlice have picked a terrifying new meal monsters. Sure, they're not exactly tasty, but when hunger hits, that's the perfect backup plan. They're going to keep getting stronger and stronger. No weakness can stop them. They started calling him a savior, because at this point, it's nearly impossible to find a house that doesn't already come with the furniture packed inside. A comfy bed and a roomy closet. Perfect setup. The butler rolled out the welcome mat and invited Dean and Chris to move in as the new tenants. Honestly, that part didn't even surprise anyone. Gene told his friend, "Your family is coming to Canham soon," and then straight up asked him to keep an eye on them. He swore he couldn't stand people, then boom, he actually did have friends. It wasn't that he hated people at all, he just hated the crowd his sister hung out with, because somehow everyone he knew was tied back to his sister anyway. So the "you don't like people" accusation was basically impossible to deny. People called him a good man, but dishonest folks kept taking advantage of everyone's kindness. The moment they arrived, he'd rush them through the place, freeing up the third floor for them, because the hero promised, "Don't stress your family with kids. So of course, you'll want to stick together and make friends." Even if the neighborhood felt a little awkward for now. 3 gold-rank folks decided to plant themselves near the city center, and you can tell the rush is real. Most people are hunting for safer, more central ground. The monsters had already wrecked the nearby city wall. So yeah, it wasn't exactly shocking, and if they had to, they could hide on the 3rd floor of their house. The hero thanked them and said his place was free too, so no one needed to panic. Then the butler snapped that if that was the case, they'd clear out the house they were in behind them. I'm telling you, they were dead set on buying it. He claimed there was a strict rule anyone could only buy 2 houses. The man bragged that they'd already snagged their own home and a rental too, so now he was going to do it. Dvoretsky leaned in with a request for the hero, then told him to spill the details later. About a month and a half had zipped by since the family headed to Konam, and during that whole time, he threw himself into fixing up the new house. Then he slipped into the library to read, chatted with Ash, and kept the days rolling. He prayed the guy would love their brand new home. Then someone knocked. Dinosaur. The man barked that we had to go inside right now and finish the conversation in there. The woman hushed the kids and told them to keep it down, because they were heading to visit someone's house. Dinosaur warned him, "Be careful, this whole thing smells way too suspicious." He warned that their arrival was bound to get exposed anyway, and trying to keep it secret would only turn into a much bigger mess. It was one of his houses, and the woman pressed him, when did he first step into the city? And what fake date would they use for their first meeting? He just dodged the question, muttering that they met last fall or maybe way back in the spring. You could say they'd only been around him for about a year, and the woman warned the kids if anybody questioned them, they'd claim they'd known the djinn forever, and they'd never, ever give up the real date. They'd already eaten. But if they'd known he'd show up, they wouldn't have no one ate beforehand. The kids were practically begging, "If the hero cooks, we'll clean the whole plate." The man urged him to join, but the hero shrugged and said he'd whip up a batch for just one first. They ditched the horses and their stuff at the inn for now, yet he still pushed to lock in a year-long lease on that house as soon as possible. He told them to check out the house next door, he could rent it. But only for a little while, until they found another place. Then he shoved a key into their hands and said, "Go on, take a look," while he cooked. That house was his, too, right by a demonic forest, where monsters have slipped through the walls before, so they'd better take that threat seriously. The hero baked pincers, and the little pies were already in motion. Now tell me, what tasty dishes can you whip up in no time with jarred pickled tomatoes and mozzarella? The man said the house next door was stunning, and the woman stared in pure awe at how far the place and every piece of furniture had come, because even the rooms looked beautiful now. 2 beds sat there, and the boy snatched the top one so the hero felt a wave of relief. The lease spelled out the attic, and the girl swore her mom had already found the place. The neighbors all had their own mess to deal with, so he figured, we should have a way out fast if anything goes wrong. That's why he pushed for an emergency exit in the attic, and when Dvoretsky asked about it, he nodded in agreement. After they argued it out, he sold the place where he and the others had been staying and bought a new house instead. Because if there's any escape route, having a different owner on the other side makes it way harder to notice. The guy promised, we'll be home today. So he swung into action to grab them while the butler scrambled to apologize for the interruption. Dinosaur called himself the Shadow Wolf, and the man's face fell like he hadn't heard that name in forever. They were old friends, adventurers used to whisper that name like a dare. They crossed paths when he was still brand new, and the boy insisted that the memories of him grinding them down to exhaustion still beat the truth that he'd ended up as nothing more than a humble butler. He thanked her, admitting that landing help abroad was a nightmare back then, something the hero never even thought about. Because the butler wasn't always a butler. The Wolf King was behind it all. He could have vanished for a while, but make no mistake, he's a gold-ranked adventurer. The man said he chose this name for himself and couldn't recall what his parents called him. Then his wife gave him a different one, and that's what he uses now if he's under that name. She has to be the same girl, and the Duke really did bind that spirit. Dinosaur already knew all about Ash, how her father used the spirit to crank her courage way up, and the guy admitted they'd been dealing with some rough neighbors. But the second they saw that house, giving it up felt impossible. The woman said it didn't sound right hollow, like it was empty and a thin draft slipped through the crack. The house looked flawless. No cracks anywhere, so everyone had one chilling question: where was the wind even getting in from? It had to be sneaking through some opening, and the scariest part, this place was newly bought, and the attic still hadn't been renovated. No gaps, no drafts. If you seal that opening, nobody's getting in or out. From the outside, that passage looks just like a plain wall, until it's time to squeeze through. She was shutting up shop when he snapped that he'd catch her doing this in public again, and the butler fired back, saying he had nothing to do with it. He was hiding, yet his actions gave him away in the strangest way, like he didn't even realize it. The woman snapped that she'd go check on the children. The hero got hit with a brutal question. What was he hiding? And from who? He snapped back that he wasn't doing anything shady, just terrified his powers would drag the wrong kind of person right to him, and it all mostly started with his sister, even though he'd already cut ties. And as long as the other gods held more power than the light, he figured he'd be safe. The girl told him she didn't mind them learning his abilities, then leaned in with a bright smile, asking if the more people who knew, the bigger the chance his secret would leak. He says the rumors burn out fast until you witness it with your own eyes. It won't stick in your head, and that's exactly his twist. People find it hard to keep obsessing over him. The girl shrugged and said he just knocks out anyone who gets in his way. But the truth was darker. He doesn't even like talking, and he doubts he'll ever be able to talk her back around. So nobody brought up the genie at the Merchant Guild. What felt weird was how the rumors kept singling out the butler, the one who helped with the medicine making, and even the girl herself. The hero just admitted he knew his weak spots, so he kept his distance from every group activity. Dinosaur said that from the very start he knew something was off with him, like the spirits were shamelessly dodging him, yet somehow he could still see them, just like his wife. He said she was right. He could handle himself just fine. But if he'd struck a pact with a spirit, then he could even call for an escort. He'd already said it, and it still sounded wild. How could he be this strong without one? Spirits adored adventurers, and if people ever quit the path, they sometimes lose the gift to even see spirits. He'd made his pact already. He just wasn't ready to let outsiders get anywhere near it yet. He's so sweet he'd rather not get kidnapped by some creepy stranger or fall under the sway of weird spirits. Especially since the butler warned him that normal folks can't lay a hand on spirits. No matter what hour it was, he swore his spirit stayed sweet as sugar. Out of every Indian he'd spotted, this one stole the show. He was downright adorable. The hero leaned in and asked, "Want to come with me?" He'd love having his company, but he didn't want to shove anyone into it. So Jin told him, "If you feel weird about it, let's pause and come back to this later." That little puppy was absolutely adorable, like, "Stop your heart cute." The boy snapped that nobody was allowed to touch him, and Chris boiled with frustration. He was being robbed of his chance to feel that magnificent creature up close. Today he was set to whip up a meal for Dean and the others, like a thank you for all that massive food they'd shared with him the other day, and he figured, why not at the same time? Bring Rich into the group. The butler shot an apology out for bursting into their space. The boy swore someone had shoved a ton of mushrooms into his hands, So he invited them over anyway, only for the butler to slam the whole thing down and deny it. He'd convinced himself he was at fault, because back then he'd backed him too. Yet nobody could have predicted this, especially not with that puppy sitting right at his feet. Dinosaur was praying he hadn't let it slip to anyone. Then the guy hit him with, "Relax, I already showed it to Ash and the rest." Grandpa heard the rule, no puppies creep through the night without leaving a single sound, and he figured this spirit was on another level entirely, the kind that even he, who couldn't see spirits at all, still somehow noticed. Rich had a spirit so strong it felt dangerous to bring him out in public. Sure, the butler warned it would spark a massive uproar, but the puppy was always hanging around. And in the beginning, he was still fragile and weak, yet somehow, even as a pup, everyone already treated him like he was built to endure. The real kicker, he hated crowded places. His comrades started doubting him, and the protagonist snapped back that it was his decision to bring them along and he'd feel a lot better if I watched her. Chris looked him in the eye, grateful to the core, and promised he'd do everything in his power to make sure that trust never went to waste. He'd heard that adventurers were usually joined by fire spirits, and this guy, he rolled around with a dragon that stayed right at his heels. The hero snapped, admitted it was his fault, and then started throwing his comrades' names at each other like they were finally meeting for real. Dinosaur got asked if he was a Balmor, and with a confident snap he said, "Yeah, that's me." They swore he vanished into the dungeon. But the man promised he'd be back tomorrow, so everyone was holding on to hope and counting on him. Chris introduced himself and told Dean he'd never forget the chance to meet him. Then Dean stepped in too, introducing himself right back. Balmor was wildly famous, so famous that even the incredibly isolated had heard his name once, though the only people who actually knew him were his relatives or the older folks who'd been around long enough to remember him. To the hero, he looked like just an ordinary guy, nothing more than a devoted husband, a steady father, and a normal life. Until the genie handed him bread and, with a shake in its voice, apologized. The man warned him that if he didn't want to drag unwanted attention onto himself, he had to stop roaming the city while carrying a spirit. The guild practically warned, tough times are coming, and he agreed someone his rank should be hitting the dungeon, not roaming the city. Then she dropped the real reason she wanted to teach her children. He said Dean's vibe had turned so intense it was like a girl clinging to love with her whole heart, so it was starting to grind on his nerves, and when Dean asked back, he insisted that any guy in his shoes would have been just as captivated, especially since he wasn't much older than them. Plus, he bragged that he had wonderful kids and planned to teach all three of them. Jean admitted he didn't know the nickname, only that he knew his wife. Dean gushed that she was strong and stunning, and that he'd hit the jackpot. The hero nodded along. The girl leaned in and asked if she was his type, and he snapped back that he was only jealous of his family. Even though they weren't exactly a peaceful farming family, he still saw them as a good one, because the love between them gnawed at him. Sure, they'd be fine, but he could only warn them, don't go stirring up trouble and drag the kids into it. Maybe the scents were heavy and the perfume clung to everything, but it still felt wrong, like you weren't treating him like a person. You were hauling him around in your arms like some ordinary beast. He promised he'd rein it in from now on. The hero thanked them for sticking by his side, and the man shrugged like it was no big deal. Then he warned that if he needed a blacksmith, this fortress city had the sharpest craftsmen around. And chances were, one of Rose's people would be there too. See, Rose's crew brought the kind of healer who actually cared, a compassionate saint of medicine. Though the hero just grinned and said she felt like a real thorn in his side, the kind that gives you a headache. He's already mulling over that magical steel pulled from the ash there, processing it just like normal iron. And if he can get the furnace blessed by the fire spirit, it'll forge into something tougher without changing how it's made. The hero blurted that he'd do the whole thing on his own, because somehow he already had the right gear, while the man snapped that he wouldn't even ask where it was. Jane snapped that she smelled something fishy, and right after that he swore he'd caught a weird scent too. The boy tried to pitch pepper, but he couldn't believe it even existed in this world. Then once he started cooking, the other food turned downright disgusting, so scary it felt like you'd never get used to it. The hero shrugged and said he'd just copy his old recipes, and the other day the butler went all in and served pizza topped with asparagus. He told everyone he was still a ways off, but at home, he'd already started grilling meat. Back then, he'd only tested it outdoors, so Jin nodded like, "That's a win," then reminded him not to forget the vegetables. Now that everything was set, he was ready to start the test, and he begged the spirits trapped in the fire to help him. He'd already crafted tiny weapons like knives, but this huge piece was his first real challenge, and fear still clawed at him that he might not pull it off solo, yet with every spirit lending a hand, he knew he'd make it. The sword's tip shimmered a totally different color from the rest of the blade, so he couldn't resist. He decided to test it, and he ordered his spirit animal to stay put while he went for it. There's no way the hero can use it. He knows exactly what he just pulled off. Then he turns to the spirit and demands, "So what would you do? Because this is magical steel, forged in ash." He's going to grab something delicious, then march over and apologize for what he did, using that gift as the peace offering. He showed up with sweets and wine like an apology should, and the girl just stared like, for what, exactly? He claimed the magical steel he'd once given her was inside, but he'd messed up, and now it was totally useless. Then he swallowed his pride and begged her to forgive him for squandering a gift that special. "I told you, it was his gift so he could use it any way he wanted, no strings attached." The butler's jaw dropped. He actually got blacksmithing, and then he offered to melt the whole thing down and forge it again from scratch. Gene admitted he hadn't even thought about it yet, because it was still steel. Then he wondered, in a sudden flash, if it could be melted down. The butler urged him to ring up his comrade and prove once and for all that his sword was busted. The hero snapped, "Then help yourself." And it was the very same treats he'd shoved into that apology box earlier. The man shot back that he was already locked in, ready to bear his sword whenever. Dinosaur shot him a question, "Where'd you get it?" And the guy just shrugged, saying it came straight from the storage room. The man snapped at him to shut his mouth about it. And the butler promised everything was fine since nobody had clocked anything yet. Sure enough, his bag looked suspicious as hell, but he'd outsmarted the guild with a neat little trick. He begged the hero to not melt the masterpiece. A genie thrust a sword into the girl's hands, but she snapped back that without a fire spirit, it wouldn't fit her style. Then the man warned her not to give it up so fast, because getting it back, even in public, would be a nightmare. And that blade didn't come cheap. The blade's design screamed Northern Island artisans, rarely seen around humans, and usually done with casting molds, yet the hero swore he forged it himself from magical steel then, with spirits lending their power, turned it into a real spiritual sword. While still crafting regular knives on his own, no spirits required. The man snapped that there was nothing anyone could do about it being a spirit sword, just keep it out of public view, and everything would be fine. But that answer still wasn't good enough. Because even ignoring the spirit sword part, that way of forging a blade was downright abnormal. The protagonist snapped that he didn't need some flimsy weapon, and he had zero plans to cut corners on quality, whether he was fighting or living day to day. All Dean wanted was to live easy and comfy until the butler snapped that Dean's culture and understanding blew theirs out of the water. The girl insisted that what felt normal to him was totally weird to them, and then the guy finally gave Dean the green light. He said they were trying to hammer out an agreement, then showed up with a bunch of white asparagus, no clue what the real deal even was. But sometimes you've just got to slow down and take it easy. Dean couldn't stop himself. He had to try that dish. But the moment he saw the sweet's price, he figured they cost about the same as a whole house. They stacked in a wild amount of vanilla and cocoa already worth a fortune, and tucked a sweet strawberry right inside, too. The hero had no clue he thought it was just a plain strawberry. He said, "If I buy the ingredients from the outside, you can taste them if I don't. Don't even show them." And that rule holds for everything he makes, except a sword. Because that's what you bet your life on. So he's totally fine paying for the absolute best. He ordered them to forge a brand new sword, then he'd grab the old one and claim she'd managed to get it. Because if everyone carried similar blades, his would blend in and lose its edge. The hero spilled every move he had, and the butler smiled, saying he could handle the rest. Then Dean admitted he was short on cash right now. Jin wasn't even surprised, he just grinned, and said he'd forge those for the girls first. Because Ash was the one who handed him the magical steel in the first place, and then he'd go after the boys. The main character grabbed the man's hands and thanked him, because thanks to that one act, he finally got a real cozy bed to rest on. Letza grinned and said the drink was amazing, only it wasn't tea at all. It was coffee, and yeah, most folks hated the bitter bite, but Letza always fought back. He cut it down with milk and sugar, even though that bold, strong black flavor still hits hard on its own. The genie handed him the lamp as a thank you and tossed in a glass too, maybe even a goblet or a mug. With the lamp already in motion in his hands, he didn't stop, and he started forging the other pieces side by side. They're crafted with extra durable glass for everyday life, but don't go pouring hot drinks into them. The man said he had to run out and bring back that note, because he'd never, ever seen glass that color in his whole life. The guy swore something like that was right there. Then he grabbed a red glass for himself, and they both agreed the stuff inside the house didn't count. The man snapped back that his glass was way cloudier and pushed for one rule: keep those things out of sight. Gene promised he'd think it over, and now he's leaning toward hiding them in the kitchen or the pantry because no one wants to keep dashing upstairs for dishes, and it's way easier to just shut the shelves with doors so they're out of sight. Then the man drops the news that the Rose people are leaving Kanem. The hero snaps back that they haven't left at all. They're going berserk on purpose, trying to lure the dinosaur straight to them. If this break drags out, Amadeo and his crew will be next to roll in, and he barely managed to pull them north in the first place. Now, because they can't stop jabbering about Bammy, he feels them about to pivot and turn back. The guy even promised it's simple. All he has to do is show they want to go deeper into the forest, and the idea will snap right into their plans. For him, it all depends on how far the trip goes, but he's probably just going to slow everyone down. Jin said he'd try being a wonderful role model, yet the hero warned that if it means risking his life, he's not going to do it. Then, Jin insisted they'd go rabbit hunting with the kids, or just watch, and he even asked him not to refuse. They got a brutal training plan down into the underground in just 2 to 3 years, pushing even the kids who could already survive the trip to Khan, all while crossing mountains sealed under eternal snow. The hero swore that no matter what, the kids, though they weren't stronger than him, would still make it happen. With sheer grit, the guy admitted. He had way more of a childish streak than he ever expected, and once you're around him, every one of his slip-ups jumps out even more. Jin greeted everyone, and the woman immediately praised his work as perfect, like he sliced right through everything, with butter-smooth precision. The hero insisted he'd misheard it because he forged those kitchen knives for his comrades with his own hands. He even blamed the butler for letting the blades slip out of his home, then handed the knife to the girl as a thanks for the respect kind of gift. And when her husband returned after catching a deer, she invited the hero to sit down and join them for dinner. The kids hadn't tasted anything like that in ages, while the hero said he was counting on her, because it had been forever since he'd gotten the chance to dig into her cooking. Jin claimed he was the family's head and demanded they cut the meat. Then he grinned and thanked them for the treat. That silky, creamy sauce clung to every bite of venison like it was made for it, and you could tell she was a real top-tier chef. The man gushed that his wife cooked like an angel, beans with baked cheese piled on top, and she laughed back that it felt a bit too soon, but it was the first harvest of the season. Those beans might have been tiny, but their color was gorgeous, and the baked goat cheese brought this sharp little bitterness, yet somehow it still tasted unreal. And in that perfect moment, I couldn't stop myself from craving a family of my own. She leaned in and swore, "Then I'll be your wife." The kids rallied behind her, backing her up with full force. Dinosaur swore up and down he'd never ever go along with this. Sheva admitted she still couldn't believe it. Ash had been a girl this whole time, and the hero had been secretly tailoring her clothes the entire run. Ash's waist has suddenly gotten way slimmer, and they've had to tweak her clothes just to make them fit, because now that the curse is finally gone, she's about to look far more feminine, even if it means she has to start by wrestling that creepy look first. The hero said he'd come for one reason: he wanted to join their monster hunt and rally his comrades, and the man snapped back that if that's the plan, they'd head deeper into the forest. They had to get everything ready so they could hit the road in 5 days. If the weather held out, his friends backed out. But he wouldn't take no for an answer and would ask again, and the guy only shrugged and told him, "See you in 5 days. They're going to tear across the land on horseback." Jin swore he had to learn horseback riding, and yeah, it totally tracks his comrades. Look like they've got artificial rides down, but even Chris insists they're fresh out in this whole universe. He even mastered horseback riding because any true adventurer has to move like lightning. In that city, the guild sensed the monster invasion and instantly locked in, gathering adventurers at once, ready to snatch the best, most profitable opportunities before anyone else, since speed can make or break the deal. Before he ever stayed there, he'd already ridden through towns and villages, stalking clues, trading intel, and building connections along the way. He couldn't believe it. He'd never even sat on a horse at that rental stable. The hero bragged that he'd once ridden a reindeer fine. Let's pretend that doesn't count. He may not have saddled it, but if he can stay on a reindeer, then climbing onto a horse should be no big deal. The man pushed the idea of hitting the local stable and getting him a horse, but if things got rough, he'd climb on behind him to spare the poor beast either way. It still wasn't a good plan. Gene told them he already had a horse in mind. A familiar horse would let him get close, Sure, but he couldn't promise it would tolerate a climb, even with a contract in place. If it got too stubborn, he'd try a deer, or maybe a snow leopard. The boy shot back that if the horse refused, he'd go straight to the leopard. The man snapped, "Slow down, I can't keep up with you." The genie told him to calm down, swearing their route cut straight through the forest ground. The horses knew so they wouldn't fall behind. And sure enough, the trail marched them to a forgotten, abandoned mine. Then the hero leaned in and promised if he tagged along, he'd get a prize, a fine bottle of grape liquor, the exact same wine he'd brought as a treat. The guy begged him to go, but the man shut him down. He promised he'd tag along later, only because he knew he'd make a move eventually. Once the lineup's locked in, he still has to learn how to ride, so book everyone's horses ASAP because one horse can be used for training starting tomorrow. And if you stick with the same horse every single time, you'll start to click with it. Fast, easy rhythm, steady control. The hero promised, "I'll try." There were tons of horses there, some bred to haul carts, others trained to carry heavy loads. Ash and Knot jumped in to help and decided to team up with him today because that girl was obsessed with horses and truly knew her stuff. The butler said, "Because our route cuts through the forest, I figured a war horse would make sense, but those beasts have wild tempers. So maybe we should hunt for something smaller, calmer, and easier to handle. It won't matter a bit if he can't even saddle a horse, and renting a war horse will burn through a fortune." He rushed out an apology, then admitted the horse was pure trouble, so stubborn it kept bolting. And that's how he ended up stuck with it. Ledsy said he liked the hero, and somehow the hero was winning hearts with every kind of creature out there. Jin couldn't wrap his head around why he was being pushed to win the wild horse's favor. The man jumped in and offered a ride, but neither of them had ever mounted a horse before, and the boy snapped, "I can't stay on. Someone has to hold me." For some riders, those stirrups felt downright humiliating.